talked about it in letters, and we talked about it on the phone. But how you really feel about it, I don't really know.
What's your take on Cassavetes? 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 Misogynist. Genius. Misogynist. Genius. Misogynist. Genius. Misogynist. Genius. What's your take on Cassavetes? What's your take on Cassavetes? What's your take on Cassavetes?
Welcome to There's Sometimes a Buggy, Irresponsible Opinions About Classic Film. I'm Elise.
I'm Dave. This week, it's a quintet of films and a special subject devoted to the collaborations between Barbara Stanwyck and Frank Capra, made between 1930 and 1941. We're going to be talking about Ladies of Leisure, Miracle Woman, Forbidden, The Bitter Tea of General Yen, and The Outlier, Meet John Doe. So, Elise, before we get started on the films themselves, how about we talk a little bit about each of our protagonists for this week, where they were in their career, how they encountered each other, and maybe a little bit about the studio that allowed them to make the first 4 films, which is Columbia. So Frank Capra was a gag man in Hollywood in the mid-20s. That came up when we talked about Elizabeth Kendall's book. And he had worked his way up. He had directed some Harry Langdon movies. The silent clown that doesn't usually get retrospectives about him still, but he was kind of important for a little while there in the late 20s. Capra then moved into a range of different types of films. He made some action movies and some proto-romantic comedies. By 1930 already, he was kind of in a favored position at Columbia, which was the most ambitious of the studios on Poverty Row. So they had no theater chain. They didn't have the budget to have a big list of contract players. However, they did have Harry Cohn, who thought that he saw a way to get in on the big money by making a lot of really, really, really cheap quickies and then find someone that he could count on to bring in a little bit more prestige and box office. And he settled on Frank Capra already by 1930. That would really work out well for both of them. By the mid-30s, Capra was raking in the awards and big, big money for Columbia. Barbara Stanwyck, on the other hand, had been on the stage.
Well, she'd been a Follies girl.
Right.
And then eventually she was still very young, but then she started out very young. She was very poor, and I think she lost her parents at an early age.
Famously from Brooklyn.
Yeah, so she was a chorus girl, and then she got an acting part playing a chorus girl in a Broadway play, and then she got a starring role in a Broadway play, Burlesque. She succeeded at that. I imagine it was during this period that she met her husband, the famous vaudevillian.
Frank Fay.
And then next thing you know, she was in pictures.
Yeah, well, he went to Hollywood and had some immediate success that kind of faded by like 1931. But in 1930, he was a big star in Hollywood. He had actually pulled some strings to get an audition for his wife, for Capra's next film. And this gets repeated all over the place. Apparently, she didn't like the whole idea of this, that she was brought in only because she was Frank Fay's wife, and she came into the interview and acted like an asshole.
And as only Barbara Stanwyck can, I imagine.
Yeah, Frank Capra hated her, and he's like, you don't even want to be here. You're acting like a jerk. Get out of here. Frank Fay had made a screen test of her as well, and he saw that, and he was like, oh, that's the same person? Bring her back here. I want her for Ladies of Leisure. Anyway, that's the tale that got around that was sort of trademarked by Frank Capra. He told it everywhere, and I guess people seem to think that maybe that was true. I don't know.
Right, and they fell in love and started an affair on this movie. It was complicated. We don't know a lot about the private lives of these figures, but her husband was an alcoholic and abusive. For that and other reasons, she was not able to leave him. And it would appear that the affair probably ended around the time of Bitter Tea of General Yen, because a year after that, Capra was married.
Yeah.
I assume there was some distance where he had to meet his wife and fall in love with his wife and marry her, or whatever reasons he had for marrying her. We don't know the deets. It's certainly over by Meet John Doe.
Probably a lot of it in that Stanwyck biography.
That ridiculous 2-volume Stanwyck biography, which I will never read. Double doorstop. Nobody, no figure in human history requires a 2-volume biography.
Oh, I don't know about that. Charles Sumner. The David Donald 2-volume biography of Charles Sumner is amazing.
The obvious parallel here in Hollywood history is with, as we've mentioned before in talking about these collaborations, is with Sternberg and Dietrich, to which we devoted our first 2 episodes. Their collaborations, similar situation where in that case, both parties were married. The affair had this tormented element. One person wanted more than the other person. Nevertheless, we have this artistic testament by the directors to their love for and fascination with and identification, most interestingly, with these actresses. Of course, in Europe and Japan, it seemed to be extremely common for directors to frequently work with actresses, sometimes due to love affairs or marriages. And in indie film, we also have Gena Rowlands and John Cassavetes, of course.
We certainly do.
But it wasn't the rule in Hollywood.
No, definitely not. No, there were other...
Not a string of films in a row devoted to this kind of documentation.
Few in the silent era.
I don't know, like, something about the studio system of directors having to be assigned to things and sort of factory churn out made this more difficult if you couldn't pick your projects, I guess.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Then you couldn't just say, well, I'm just going to work with this actress for however long. Although apparently Jimmy Stewart and Anthony Mann could decide to do that.
Well, they were freelancing, basically.
Well, there you go.
Or they had a special deal. Stewart had a special deal with Universal, right? They meet in 1930. Wonderful things come of it, and we're going to talk about all of that. Now, these films came up. We referred to them. They form the basis of the first chapter of Elizabeth Kendall's book, where she cites them as the secret origin of the Depression romantic comedy.
Right.
Especially...
Which is very contentious, as we talked about.
Especially but Ladies of Leisure. I think she's right on the money with that.
Let's start talking about Ladies of Leisure, and we can talk about that. So we saw a recent restoration of this film, a digital restoration. It was a revelation. It went from, like, I didn't understand why Kendall was so obsessed with it when she was talking about it, whenever we were reading the book for that episode. But it went from seeming like a kind of interesting, low-key melodrama to seeming like one of the best films of 1930 and seeming already like a Capra film, like everything's all there already.
This is where people get into trouble who want to say that Robert Riskin brought all of the themes to Capra because this is way before. But there is that book, Joseph McBride's book. Joseph McBride is an interesting writer, and I don't remember the book well enough to refute it point by point, but he does, and he's not the only one. Many people have tried to argue that Capra has taken credit for things that really Robert Riskin is responsible for. It just seems like Capra was making Capra movies well before they started working together.
We better talk about what we mean by that. So what I mean is, we've got the ghostly father figure right at the beginning of the movie that the partygoers, what is our hero's name?
Ralph Graves?
Yeah.
Jerry Strong is the character's name.
Oh, good lord. Yes, Jerry Strong. He's at his own party, but he's not enjoying it. It's a jazz age party, as Kendall talks about, and everybody is acting in a way that is very decadent and depressing.
Capra hates that.
One of the girls at the party, one of the party girls, is spraying seltzer at a portrait of his father. So, okay, right away we've got this, as Carney talks about in a line that I read over your shoulder last night that I actually like, a desecration, like a symbolic death of the father figure at the beginning of the film. What else do I mean by a Capra film? I mean, there is the relationship, the incredibly cantankerous, almost frighteningly violent, but only emotionally violent relationship between the two lovers, which we see periodically in Capra. It's not always there, but it's there in It's a Wonderful Life. It's there, as we talked about when we did Happen One Night. It's there in that film as well. The more intense they become emotionally, the more they clash.
The impact.
But they understand this clashing. And this is the thing that resembles Cassavetes, which is also something Carney talks about, that connection with Capra and Cassavetes. They understand that this emotional violence is just the intensity of their passion for each other.
Right. The threat that falling in love represents to a subject. right? To
Sure.
the ego. Because you know that if you let this progress, whatever you were doing with your life before this moment it's over.
Yeah, of course, George Bailey articulates that in the phone scene with Mary the best.
Exactly.
There's the whole rainy sequence of her spending the night, which, as Kendall writes, gets repeated, although with a very different emotional tone and very different circumstances in It Happened One Night.
Yeah.
So there you can see where she makes a connection and says this is where Capra's kind of romantic comedy is born. And there's, of course, the protagonist's suicide attempt jumping into water, just like George Bailey. And in addition to that, there is just the plotlessness. I mean, there is a melodrama plot here, but it's mostly not focused on. Instead, there's this progression of episodes where the point of the episode is what happens emotionally between the characters and particularly to the heroine. And there's even a very painful, emotional, and desperate running up a staircase at the end of the movie that gets repeated. Did you notice in Meet John Doe?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of Capra already in this movie.
Now, Riskin's dialogue is terrific, and
Well,
he's a
sometimes-
valuable...
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's not. I have a lot of ambivalence about the Riskin films.
I think he's a really valuable contributor to the movies that they work together on. But I think Capra is kind of already whoever he's going to be by 1930.
Oh, and there's also the emphasis on the two characters being able to play together, which is not as awkwardly corny as it becomes already by The Miracle Woman. So maybe some of that is Riskin, the awkwardness. Even here, they're always just have these little private games that they play together.
Yeah, and that becomes a key to what Kendall talks about throughout her book, and also Stanley Cavell talks about in his book as a hallmark of romantic comedy, that the pair are always playing.
And Stanwyck herself is a revelation in this movie. I was thinking of her in terms of, we just did the episode with Morning Glory, the early Hepburn performances.
Yeah.
How these women are just bringing to early talkies just these extraordinary personalities. In Stanwyck's case, it has to do with her complete naturalness and comfort in front of the camera. She just acts like a person, and a fun person, and a frank and direct person, and she's just very likable.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, sometimes a little frightening in her emotional intensity and her default to anger all the time. No one gets angrier faster and harder than early Stanwyck. And she always retains that, she always holds that in reserve, no matter, even in the 50s, she can still get angry, like, in a second.
Yeah.
In a film, in a moment where you're not expecting anger, where you're expecting something else.
She really flips out in several of these movies. Let's go back to the beginning of the film. So Jerry Strong, artist, sick of this upper-class jet-set lifestyle he's leading, drives off in search of something else. And what does he find? Well, a boat is docked where there's a really decadent Prohibition-era party going on, and sees a girl rowing back to the shore by herself. It turns out when she gets into focus, she's in a torn dress. So bad things have been happening on this boat, and she is sick of it as well. Right there, you've got the romantic comedy pairing that Kendall is interested in.
Yes,
the
but
mismatched class.
between classes, yeah.
Both looking for a new social setting for themselves, or just desperately trying to get out of the lives that they have been stuck in until the beginning of the film. An amazing first meeting, really interesting face-off between them before he offers her a ride, or she basically invites him to offer her a ride. They start playing right away, as you say, right? She's doing faces, getting to know each other. Who else would make a movie so insanely in your face about the spiritual element that the artist values the most is hope?
Right,
I mean,
she represents hope.
So he immediately,
Like the hope people are searching for in the Depression.
Yeah.
And don't think that Capra's not thinking about that.
Well, the Depression was not even happening when he started filming this. Made in 1929, I think. So the crash happens at the end of that year.
So what is the hope that this girl represents then? Because already I'm thinking of this, that's another theme that comes up here, that there is a figure who symbolizes something to the artist figure. I mean, with the Riskin films, we get, well, The first Riskin film is The Miracle Woman because it was based on a play that he co-wrote.
Yeah, but he didn't work on the film at all.
No.
So we have no idea what that play was like. I guess we could find out, but we don't know.
No, but it starts with that film and continues with the Riskin films like Mr. Deeds and Meet John Doe, that there is a figure that takes on these symbolic qualities that give hope to other people.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So I feel like there's almost a faint suggestion of that here as well. But this hope that she has, as he discovers as they try to capture it on the canvas, is well buried under many layers of cynicism and disillusionment. And she keeps poking fun at the concept that she could be... So this is what's so interesting. So we've got this figure of the artist who, let's face it, must be representing the director in some sense, with his actress, and he keeps trying to turn her into this symbol, and she keeps fighting back. And you feel like the symbol keeps talking back, and you feel like the authorial voice is identifying more with her than with the artist figure that's supposed to be representing him. I just find identification, as with the Sternberg movies, the patterns of identification in these movies so fascinating.
Yeah, well, because Capra knows... That's the amazing thing about Capra, because he is the most self-aware ironist in so many ways, and also the charge of Capricorn and optimism. I mean, I dismiss it in terms of the films, but it is always an element of his movies. So this is what people mistake. They mistake an element of the movie for the whole of the film. And Jerry Strong definitely represents just that one tendency that's in Capra. And the movie definitely knows that, like, this is not how you make great art. You don't try to take Barbara Stanwyck's lipstick off and pretend that she's just this ethereal thing called hope. Jerry Strong is not on the right track with this. Getting more on track as they become more in tune with each other later in the film. But what his initial plan is stupid.
Stanwyck character has way more, like you say, the artist character only has that one characteristic. The Stanwyck character has all of the other characteristics of the authorial voice.
And if you think about this film, and you think about all the other films, and I'm certainly drawing on Ray Carney, whose book, American Vision from the 80s, I first read in the 90s, and I've been revisiting it the past couple of days just to get back in step with it. And I don't agree with everything he has to say, but certainly the way he situates Capra within the larger context of American art and letters is useful.
Hey, does he talk about Ladies of Leisure as a portrait of a lady? Or portrait of a not a lady? Or portrait of a chorus girl? Or party girl, I guess she is.
Just like our podcast, Ray Carney, every single chapter mentions Henry James and Hawthorne and Emerson. And, you know, a lot of people that we don't tend to talk about, although they're interesting. Painters like Edward Hopper and Eakins and Sargent. Winslow Homer comes up a lot. What Carney wants to say is that Capra is, you know, he describes him as the preeminent transcendentalist filmmaker. I might say that Vidor is right up there with him, or even more so. But anyway, he never talks about Vidor, so we'll forget about that for now. What a figure like Jerry Strong, he is after the same kind of game that Emerson is after. What he wants to fix his gaze upon is impossible to name. Calling it hope makes it sound trite, and it sounds trite in the film, and I think it's meant to, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think that you're supposed to think, oh, this is inspiring, that this artist has settled upon the theme of hope. As it goes along, what happens is that you realize that hope, that's just a placeholder name for what he's looking for, which is...
But it is interesting that this girl who has had a very hard time in life and yet somehow keeps going and even seems like she's enjoying her life, it is interesting that this girl symbolizes that for him.
There's a connection between them, but they can't name what it is or what it means. For Carney, that's what a Capra character is in essence. It's a character who can't really speak what they want to say.
The artist figure is not completely mocked or dismissed.
No.
Because there is this gorgeous scene that is very Capra, in the way it all falls together perfectly, where you see an actual emotional connection being made on the screen, right, between the characters and actors, where they are outside on the balcony in his penthouse. He's trying to get her to look up at the stars, and then they start sort of having an argument about whether that's something that's worthwhile to do. She doesn't think, she wants to look down at the lights in the city. That's what's exciting to her, not this misty ideal, right?
Yeah.
And then they have a little awkward exchange where the man acts very shy, as he often does in Capra at certain points. It ends up with her realizing that he loves her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that he's in, not that he loves her, but that he likes her. And then, after that exchange, she gets a smile on her face, and dreamy smile on her face, and then she looks up at the stars involuntarily, not because he told her to like it's an idea, but just as an impulse, because she's feeling that emotion.
Yeah.
And then he's like, well, now I found the thing. Sounds corny, but the way it's all done so beautifully, it really works. It makes sense.
Camera work by Joseph Walker is indispensable. Capra couldn't do the things that he's trying to do here without the beautiful camera work that's in evidence in all of these films. No, I don't think he's mocking Jerry Strong.
And that's what goes straight into the "it happened one night."
Some of the dialogue is very similar, right? Like reaching up and grabbing the Big Dipper in "It Happened One Night." Clark Gable talks about reaching up and stirring the stars around, so
I was thinking about why I don't like "It Happened One Night" as much as other people, kind of what role it serves in Capra's filmography, and it seemed to me that by using those two actors, Gable, who's not like a Capra protagonist at all, like the kind of men he usually gets to play his male leads, and Claudette Colbert, who I don't think he works with her again, does he?
No, well, he pretty much only worked with Jean Arthur and Stanwyck.
Right. By getting these two actors that he doesn't normally work with to kind of be slotted into these roles, ladies of leisure roles, that are so personal to him, it's almost like he makes this type and this dynamic sort of abstract and anonymous and universal, and therefore allows it to be translated into a type of romantic comedy, rather than it being so personal and individual to him.
Certainly the Stanwyck films feel a lot more raw, because she is a much rawer presence than Claudette Colbert, and that's something that Kendall goes into, right?
Well, this is so interesting that seeing Bitter Tea of General Yen, which is the most polished of the films they made together, it's an A picture, and then seeing Meet John Doe right after, what a different performer she is. Still great, but what a different performer she is by the early 40s, because she's a movie star, right? She modulates her voice to sound more attractive. She's styled to be more glamorous, and she commands the screen in a movie star way.
She's got less of a Brooklyn accent.
Sometimes she has more of it, so sometimes she's playing it up. That's what Sturgis uses so well in The Lady Eve, this absolute star quality that she has by this point. In Bitter Tea of General Yen, she is still this kind of natural, raw, impulsive actor, and he, other than Bitter Tea of General Yen, and only intermittently in that one, he never even, now this is a stark difference from Dietrich and Sternberg, he really never objectifies her.
I think
and
some people might say the Miracle Woman.
He doesn't try to style her or photograph her in any particularly flattering ways. She just is what she is.
Well, don't you think Miracle Woman has certainly a special set of outfits anyway?
I guess.
The diaphanous white gowns.
You find that sexualizing? But what a way to sexualize a woman.
Sure.
By putting her in, holy robes. And Bitter Tea of General Yen has that same kind of ambivalence about objectifying the character.
Oh, it definitely has...
Or the actress or whatever.
Yeah, it has ambivalence, and we see her wrestle with it in both the movies, right? In Miracle Woman as well. She's not very comfortable with the showbiz aspects of her ministry, but it goes over big with her parishioners, so they keep doing it. Connection between them builds throughout the film, obviously, and there's a crescendo that we do get a confrontation. It definitely anticipates the It's a Wonderful Life scene where he shakes her and is angry about the fact that he's falling in love with her. You don't really see these kinds of scenes in any other director's films that I can think of.
Let's talk about, maybe Cassavetes. It gets more violent in Cassavetes.
I'm talking about movies from this era, yeah.
Sure. Do you think in Borzage ever?
Not maybe? Like this. In Borzage, the male character might mock the female character as a way
of... He might also threaten her in some of the movies.
But not in this way, where they're so worn raw by the fact that they're about to confess their love that they want to scream.
Yeah, this is the thing about this movie. It really is an indie film in that these two characters aren't like any other characters ever put on the screen by anybody. They are so individual. They run this weird emotional gamut from this really playful relationship that they have with each other that seems so natural, and then on the other hand, this high levels of emotional violence. We should talk about that nighttime scene and how much Capra movies rely on precipitation.
They do.
There is a little bit of shy, well, it's a really interesting mixture actually of this kind of shy objectification of Stanwyck, but it's tied to, and Kendall writes about this, but it's tied to her own subjective sexual and emotional feelings, right? So it's not just strictly objectification. It's all tied together. It's like the camera's feeling erotic about her, but she's also feeling erotic.
That's what excites Capra.
And when he asks her to spend the night because of her past, she assumes that he's going to make a pass at her. And
she feels threatened a little bit.
I don't think so.
Anticipatory, anyway. And...
No. Let me finish, and then you can... Like, you have to read the scene so people could get different things out of it, the way that she's feeling. But what I see is that she's feeling simultaneously disappointed that she's going to be objectified in this way by this man that she hoped for better from because she loves him. And at the same time resigned to giving in to it because she loves him.
Right. Yeah, okay.
And that is what makes her so sad and tremulous and fearful and at the same time anticipatory. And then she's so relieved, of course, to discover that he does care about her enough not to make a pass at her.
Yeah, his big scheme for the night is to put a blanket on her when she falls asleep.
Which is very different than the first night that Ellie Andrews and, what's his name, Peter Warren?
Yeah.
Spend together, in which she's actually afraid of being raped by a stranger. Well, and then is so relieved that she wasn't. The next morning that they have a wonderful breakfast together.
Right. Well, they don't have a wonderful breakfast together the next day, right? Because she has fallen much more deeply in love with him, really trying to knock him out with her domestic skills the next morning. He wakes up to the sound of eggs cooking or frying.
In like a swimming pool of grease.
Doesn't seem very healthy. It goes so badly, right? Because he's in his Jimmy Stewart, I don't want any plastics, he wakes up in that mood when he sees her doing this.
Oh, and it's so interesting, too, during that whole nighttime section where Capra is cutting between her in the living room and him in his bedroom, but where she is emotionally open as well as open for us to look at. He is so closed off in both ways. He is not confronting his feelings to the same degree, nor is the director as interested in his feelings. But we are showing him just so we can know that he's feeling disturbed about this night, too.
Yeah, it's not like the comparable scene in Mitchell Lyson's film, Hands Across the Table, where both Fred McMurray and Carol Lombard are equally going through the exact same gamut of emotions. In this film, really about Stanwyck, and Ralph Graves is just annoyed, kind of, about this inconvenience. He also kind of wants her there, but yeah, it's really just troubling.
He's opaque to himself.
Yeah, and even more so in the morning. I mean, he just acts like a complete fool at breakfast, and she starts to bubble over with tears. I mean, it's an incredible scene.
Well, this is Capra again. Who can have an actress cry for this long?
It might be the best scene in the film.
During a domestic love scene.
Stanwyck is just incredible.
She starts trying to do tricks and she can't do it, and she's blubbering, and
it's so good. It all gets interrupted by the dad showing up and acting like a complete bastard.
Well, and yeah, this is what actually, interestingly, the dad showing up, this is what actually brings Ralph Graves to the point of realizing and declaring that he loves her.
Yeah, exactly. Because the time has come for a decision. He's either going to have to accede to his dad's wishes.
And this is also tied up for him. Like, his father, his businessman father, has not been happy about him being a painter either, and they want to get him properly married off and, like, doing business stuff with his life.
Yeah.
So this affair is tied to being an artist for him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Actually says, when he's talking it over with them, maybe the same part of me that wants to be an artist, that wants to be a painter, is what makes me love this girl.
And that's how he conceives of the whole thing as a package. They will get married and go away to Arizona and paint.
And she will work for him. The gender roles aren't great. She will work for him and support him, just like Jack Kerouac's
Well, yeah,
girlfriends
that's what she says she'll do, yeah.
pose for him.
I guess so. There's a lot of other stuff going on in this film. The friendship between Mary Prevost and Stanwyck is wonderful,
Yeah,
too.
despite the fact that she spends most of the movie being subjected to fat jokes.
I mean, Mary
She's
Prevost...
adorable.
She's also a very sad story, right? Like, she was a star, and I think she had a drinking problem. She did change a little bit physically, but of course she's still beautiful in this film. But yeah, they do have a lot of jokes that are not acceptable.
But she is taken seriously as...
She's an amazing character.
As a friend
What a
to
great
Stanwyck.
friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. She has an incredibly heroic moment at the end where she's risking giving herself a heart attack by running up 20 flights of stairs.
When she's not in shape, yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
I couldn't do it.
It looks like she's really suffering by the end. It's not treated comically at all. She's in danger.
No, it's treated like the run up the stairs at the end of Meet John Doe.
Yeah.
And she is trying to save Stanwyck from
She is.
suicide.
That's exactly what she fears is going to happen. It's never too early to mention in a Capra podcast that every single one of these films has suicide or suicide attempts in it.
I did mention it, didn't I? Yeah, when I was listing off the Capra features.
It's incredibly central to pretty much every movie that Capra ever made, except for Arsenic and Old Lace, where they're killing people instead.
That's what you gotta do if you want to avoid the suicidal mood.
And that's not a Capra-generated project at all.
So just one more thing I want to raise is a thematic point in Capra. Even though the parents basically just exist to fulfill this melodrama role in movies like this, you know, like in Waterloo Bridge or whatever, except in this case it's both of them. They have this scene together where he tries to make them see his point of view. He spends it talking to his father's back, right? And I don't think the father ever turns around, so that's the last we see of that father. And then he turns around and discusses it with his mother, who turns out to completely betray the love and trust he puts in her here. But this is the most emotional acting I actually saw Ralph Graves do in the whole movie, this little scene with his mother there. You know, with Stanwyck, he's mostly just expressing anger, as we said. But the thematic point is the idea that somehow the father and the erotic life of the son are incompatible. And fathers are very important in Capra. His own father died when Capra was a young man, and he ended up having to support his mother and sisters. Devastating for him, both economically and emotionally. This father figure haunts all of his films. And the first time I noticed this theme was in It's a Wonderful Life, thinking about... Because in Capra's films, there's, as we've already started discussing, erotic and fear of the erotic dichotomy. And sometimes both exist in one movie, and sometimes the movie is fairly uncomplicatedly erotic, like It Happened One Night. Then sometimes the movie is just really fucked up with and unable to deal with eroticism, like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. And so the first time I noticed this incompatibility theme was in It's a Wonderful Life during one of the most erotic scenes, which is, and fun and playful scenes. They're the wonderful lyrical night that George Bailey and Mary Hatch fall in love.
After falling in the swimming pool.
After falling in the swimming pool, a happy version of the fall into the water in Capra. It ends up with her losing her robe and becomes very sexy, but in a way that's very cruel as well. That's where you see George Bailey for the first time acting. I don't know, when I was younger I thought of this as the moment where George Bailey actually kind of becomes sexually viable as a figure precisely because he's willing to tease her in this cruel way.
Threatening to sell tickets
exactly.
to exhibit her nude body.
Exactly.
And then his father dies.
And the capper of this magnificent night they spent together, just when it's getting really sexy, this is what happens, right? This is really central to the emotional life of these films. And that father's wonderful, so you wouldn't expect there to be this father-erotic conflict in that context, but there it is.
What I wanted to say before we move on is related. I thought we should talk for at least a moment or two about the confrontation scene between Jerry's mother and Barbara Stanwyck's character, Kay Arnold, because that's where the Stanwyck fireworks go into overdrive.
She often goes to anger where another actress would go to pathos.
Right, and it's incredible.
And her anger, too, I was thinking about this. Bette Davis's anger, almost always, at least in her best films, is coming out of a place of visible pain. right? So you're always understanding her as you watch it, even though it's hard to watch. But Stanwyck's anger comes from a place of anger. Now, you do understand it because there's this whole social context to her.
Well, they're trying to back her into a corner. Yeah, that's angering.
Her anger is justified. It's always justified, but it's not a choice that every actress would make.
No, but it's really effective. You know, it's not monotonously angry the whole scene. She does it all in that scene, and they wind up...
She stands up for herself.
With a big kiss at the end.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, she spends a lot of it sobbing, too, and tells her whole story about how she doesn't have a mother to fight for her. And this is, of course, that is in fact Barbara Stanwyck's story. That could have been written in there for her by Joe Swirling. Or it could have been in the original play, but it's a good match anyway. That's
an amazing line reading, too. So, yeah, there are a lot of moments that could be chosen as the best Stanwyck moment in this film.
This is the thing, she has this emotional flexibility where she can go to anger and then come back.
Yeah, she's processing it.
Yeah.
It's so compelling that her interlocutor is able to see what's going on and not just walk out, right?
Oh, yeah, she's crying by the end, too.
It's not the kind of anger, well, in this film anyway, that ends a scene. It just deepens a scene.
Well, you know, Jimmy Stewart does that too. And there's another important Capra actor. Jimmy Stewart can also go to anger. Well, sometimes he doesn't come back, but often he does. Often he does.
It's too bad Stanwyck and Stewart never made a movie together.
It would be redundant. I've said this before, but Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life is really... Capra manages to find a synthesis between this everyman figure that he wants to portray and that kind of volatile emotionality and vulnerability of the Stanwyck character in that movie, so that it's not as annoyingly symbolic as in the Riskin movies.
And for Carney, across the board, in all of the Capra movies, what's motivating, what's powering these characters is their inability to express their heart's desire, speaking the language of the heart. It's impossible to jam the metaphysical concepts that they're reaching for into language. And that is the source of irritation that causes them to have outbursts like this.
Well, I haven't done any thinking about that before. That's the first I've heard of that thesis, so I will have to process that.
There's so much that can be said about all of these movies, but we don't want to keep you for 5 hours. So we're going to jump to the next film, The Miracle Woman.
Speaking of metaphysical longing,
yes,
this is where it becomes an overt theme, or the whole subject, I guess.
What an incredible opening scene. I saw this movie for the first time as soon as it came out on videotape in the 90s. I had read about it many times before, coveted it, wanted to see it, never came on TV, finally got it, and it lived up to all of my wildest expectations.
And here at Stanwyck, using her justified anger mode to
bring down the curtain.
Yeah.
And clear the house.
And get the film started with a bang. But she's never self-righteous. That's what's interesting. Like, Joan Crawford's anger is always self-righteous. I want to do an essay just on the anger of all of the different great actresses of the studio era.
You should. That would be great.
Katharine Hepburn she's like never angry. Is Katharine Hepburn ever angry?
Well, she gets arch and insulting in things like the Philadelphia Story.
That's a bunch of bullshit. That's not really coming from the actress. That's just like put on her.
No, I don't think anger is a big part of the Hepburn repertoire.
No.
In this film, though, Stanwyck comes out guns blazing. We first meet her at the pulpit that she assumes because her father cannot ascend to it on the final day of his pastorship because he died trying to write his sermon after they dismissed him for a younger man, she says.
So father death right off the bat?
Father death right off the bat, yeah. Capra, the themes, they come right out of the Transcendentalist playbook as well. The longing for the oversoul or the transcendent is essential to human beings, but anytime you try to institutionalize it, anytime you try to build any kind of doctrine around it, it winds up being controlled by people like this deacon that she screams at.
So watching this and Meet John Doe in the same day, it became clear that that is a remaking of this film.
Absolutely.
But in The Miracle Woman, Stanwyck is both characters. She's both the John Doe and the orchestrator of it. Although, I mean, she's both characters, but then there's also...
Hornsby.
Hornsby is like an aspect of her character in Meet John Doe. But he doesn't really believe in what he's selling.
Well, no, not at all.
Not at all. But what the movie wants to have us believe and shows us with the aversion of Capra theme number 2, the suicide attempt of the hero, is that she becomes a symbol to ordinary people. And already, long before it happened one night, we get, okay, is the depression on yet?
Yes.
Okay, we get this kind of depression imagery that Kendall talks about Capra using in It Happened One Night, but we already get it here in The Miracle Woman, and with this nice clean copy that we watch, we can see the faces of the people for once.
Yeah, it looks like Let Us Now Praise Famous Men.
Yeah, the tired woman with the baby in the apartment and the tenement listening to this radio. So we see that as a symbol, she's actually doing good, despite the fact that she got into this cynically and as a form of revenge.
The play was based on the career of Amy Semple McPherson. The Foursquare Tabernacle was a huge proto-televangelist.
Was there a murder scandal associated with it?
I don't know, but there were definitely scandals. Financial scandals at the very least, which we get in this film too. But yeah, that first scene, right? There's not much to say about her unleashing her fury upon the congregation, except that you have to see it. But after that, the way Capra ends that is incredible too. There's no one in the church left except this scheming creep who just is in the church for no reason. He's a huckster and he's clapping, "Atta girl!" He just won't leave her alone. She's trying to grieve over her dead father, kneeling next to him, and this guy just horns in. I mean, his name is Hornsby.
Capra repeats that plot and that type in Forbidden. He's like the Ralph Bellamy character, and like the Ralph Bellamy character, he's playing the long game.
I find them slightly different, but
only that he is unwantedly in love with the heroine.
Yeah.
And he's willing to hang around professionally and wait a long time until he pounces.
Sure, but he brings some new ideas to her, which Bellamy doesn't. This guy, I mean, his speech is great. Gets to the heart as well of a very important aspect of Capra, which is this cynical approach to mass manipulation. He
does make a speech just like the Nietzschean philosopher at the beginning of Babyface, but with this theme that you're talking about.
Basically use your power. Your power in this case is the Bible and the fact that you've got preaching ability. And that can work for you as long as you don't believe what you're talking about.
I thought it was really interesting that when she's doing her speeches as Sister Fallon, she delivers them in a completely different way than the speech at the beginning, in the church.
Oh, sure.
And she delivers them like she's not good at public speaking, and I kept wondering if that was some kind of act that she's putting on to make herself sound more believable.
Yes. No, this is all very carefully calculated.
But by Stanwyck and Capra, too.
Yeah, and it's reaching people on exactly the wavelength that is required.
She's a real John Doe.
Yeah.
Or Jane Doe.
We skip over all of the setup and everything, and
She does, however, appear to believe that if she could sincerely pray for David Manners to get his sight back, that it would happen.
I don't think that we're ever meant for a moment to think that she doesn't believe in God. Or the supernatural.
Or miracles.
Exactly. She just is disgusted with the way it has been embodied in the church that she grew up in and in every other arrangement that people have come up with. We get a lot of discussions about this between her and Hornsby. She is constantly agitating for a more honest presentation. Hornsby is like, no, you can't have this kind of scam going without shills. You've got to have people who are going to come up and do paid testimony and all
And he's right, of course.
In the real world, he's right, yeah, but in her world, no. I mean, it doesn't work for her, and she thinks that if these guys were gone, people would be responding naturally to her appeal.
Yeah, but I don't know if we're to think that even in the world of the film that would be true.
No, I don't think that it's true, but it's how she conceives of it. And that works for them. Hornsby is just content to be the cynical side of the partnership. He'll just sort of let her go on believing that maybe she could succeed without the shills, but they're never going to find out.
And this would all be fine and continue to work, except that he wants to marry her.
Yeah, that becomes a problem. So Hornsby, he doesn't follow his own advice. He starts to believe at least one thing, that he should marry Florence Fallon. She has met David Manners in the meantime.
David Manners, and maybe... Did I already say this? Maybe this is the element that Riskin brings, is actually an important character.
He's great in this movie.
He's the first... Well, this is only the second movie, but he's actually not just there to kind of prop up Stanwyck.
No.
He is an interesting character in his own right. And again, this is the beginning of the innocent boy character in Capra, in this case achieved by the fact that he has been symbolically castrated by being blind.
Yes, he was in World War One, a flyer, and lost his eyesight back then, so he's been blind for 14 years.
And you know how symbolically castrated he is because Stanwyck keeps calling him a boy. And
True.
yet this is no impediment to her forming a romantic attachment to him.
Well, he's a pretty charming guy. He's definitely good looking.
Yes, but she calls him a little boy
Yeah.
even as she's falling in love with him. So this is all fucked up and interesting.
Well, she can't be a very experienced woman herself in terms of romance, right? I mean, she was raised by and seems to have doted upon and spent every moment of her life with her dad, right up until the time that she goes into this.
So she's one of these Capra characters or Riskin characters who has only two emotional settings. I'm in love with my dad, and I'm in love with a little boy who reminds me of my dad.
Yeah, that's a very common
And,
thing.
Man, this is not comfortable.
In the movies.
This is not comfortable.
Well, wait till we get to Meet John Doe. That will be the ultimate, the apotheosis.
Yeah. His way of expressing himself, his incredibly twee inner life that he unfolds before her, which wins her over and charms her, is not comfortable to me. I am not comfortable with this. I wouldn't be comfortable if it was a little girl pulling out dolls and playing with them on a date. What the hell is going on
These
here?
are weirdos, Elise. That's part of what I love about this movie. Yeah, this is not cool. That's for sure.
Really not cool or sexy.
But they're taking a real chance here. They don't have to do this. This is something that's integral to the film. These are real outsider weirdos. And she is making a lot of money at this point, but she's still a strange person locked up in her tabernacle. And he is stuck in his apartment. He can't really...
With a dummy.
Yeah, and Beryl Mercer.
He can't date, so this is how he's been spending his time. For the past 14 years, this is what he has been doing. He's been learning how to be a ventriloquist and entertaining himself with little gewgaws
and writing songs.
Yep.
That's where we meet him. He is a composer or songwriter of some sort, and he's been sending out song after song to publishing houses. They all come back.
So what do you think of that suicide shot?
Oh, it's amazing.
Straight down.
I think it's to the film's credit that they don't make him any kind of a smooth operator. He is...
the opposite.
He's the opposite.
He reminds me of, most of all, except being more handsome, way more handsome, of something like Steve Buscemi in Ghost World. It's like he's pulling out his comic book collection and showing it to her, and she's like, this is delightful! I want more of this!
She hasn't met anyone like this. It's the earnestness of his desire to connect, I think, that matters.
Well, even as she's falling in love with him, she's crying tears of pity over him. It's such a weird relationship.
It is.
Well, it's not just pity. She's crying tears at his vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly.
The fantasy here is of a woman who can see you at your most vulnerable and love you for it.
Yes.
And I'm not that woman, I don't think.
Well, see, you wouldn't have liked me when I was 15. I probably was like this guy.
I would have kicked you.
Yeah. I think you're right that a lot of these characters that may or may not originate with Riskin are 15-year-old boys, afraid of girls but desperately in love with them.
Oh, and he mentions several times how afraid he is of her.
Yeah, and Gary Cooper's characters act that way too.
Yeah, and the dummy has to talk for him when he wants to say anything romantic.
Right.
It's all a little creepy. But I've said this before, the Riskin male gives me a creepy vibe. But he's also endearing.
Yeah, I think that's fine. The way it's shot, when they sing The Farmer in the Dell, it's so beautiful.
And Stanwyck laughing at her own terrible voice.
It's so good. That's one of my favorite shots in any movie.
Yeah, it's
where
very
she's,
endearing.
oh, the farmer. It's so great.
Going lower and lower.
Yeah, they have their spiritual coming together here, but of course
It certainly brings out... Weren't we saying that Stanwyck can't play? We were, in some context in one of our episodes, we were saying that, talking about It Happened One Night, that Stanwyck can't play with another actor. That's not part of her romantic setting. Well, these films make her do it.
It's true.
Ladies of Leisure, and particularly this one, they make her do it. And of course she can.
Yeah, she can.
But she doesn't later. She doesn't respond. She does love Henry Fonda for his vulnerability in The Lady Eve, but her love is more sadistic.
Henry Fonda in that movie is just the same kind of freak. He's a snake-obsessed scientist. I mean, he doesn't have any other...
There's a continuity between this character and the typical screwball male. But Henry Fonda in that movie is supposed to be like a 15-year-old scared of women boy.
Yeah.
Who's obsessed with snakes.
Likewise, Cary Grant in Bringing Up Baby.
Who's obsessed with bones, old bones.
Yep. This is a good template for a lot of what would follow in romantic comedy. But it itself certainly is not a romantic comedy. It's something
Except
else.
in those scenes.
Yeah, in those scenes, we're getting very intense connections between two weirdos, which is what you want from your 30s romantic comedy. But there's a lot of other stuff going on here. I really like the relationship between David Manners and Beryl Mercer as well.
Yeah. The landlady.
Now, she, too...
From Arsenic and Old Lace, is she?
No.
What do I know her from?
She's in a lot of movies in the early 30s. She plays the mother in Public Enemy.
Good lord, really? Okay, I guess I've just seen her in a lot of things.
But she's not Josephine Hall, that's who you're thinking. They look a little bit similar.
You know what, I think I am thinking of Josephine Hall.
But yeah, Beryl Mercer, I find very lovable in this movie, Mrs. Higgins. She also has a creepy relationship with him, in a way, right? She does wish she was 30 years younger so she could marry him.
Sure. Typical landlady talk with a handsome young tenant.
Sure, but if being obsessed with your father is creepy, this has got to be creepy too. I'm not saying any of it is... bad. It's just...
And they have that cute little Mulholland Drive scene where they break into the tabernacle.
Oh,
together.
that's amazing. But what about when he comes home and he's knocking on her door? She's not in her apartment. She's in his apartment. She's waiting for him in his apartment at 4 a.m. That's amazing. It's weird.
They're real pals.
And then, yeah, they break into the tabernacle together so that he can manufacture his miracle. And, of course, the great line, if we're burglars, I don't approve. Even a couple of scenes where Stanwyck is off screen are remarkable in this movie, I think.
So this ending where the fire starts, this tabernacle apparently holds an endless amount of people because they just keep pouring out and there's more and more and more. What I don't understand, I mean, this is replayed in the mob scene at the end of Meet John Doe, where he's trying to get everybody to calm down and listen to him, right?
Sure.
And they're throwing things at him and then he has to be pulled out of there. But she keeps shouting, if you have faith, something about if you have faith, you'll be all right. But what I don't understand is, has she now decided that she believes so entirely in miracles or whatever, or her own power, that she means that they should stay in there?
No.
Or she means they'll be all right and they don't have to trample each other to death?
That's how I've always understood it,
Okay.
that she's trying to...
So it is sort of rehearsal for the Meet John Doe sequence.
Of course, because she's about to reveal that she's a fake, just like he was about to give the full story about him being a fake. It's exactly the same. It's all very much coming out of Hawthorne, too. Dimsdale trying to reveal to the world that he is an adulterer, right? Like, that's the text for these Capra scenes of confession in public. After torment.
Do you think Capra read the Scarlet Letter?
Oh, yes, of course he did.
Why would that be obvious? He was going to be an engineer. How do I know he's reading classic American literature?
Well, we do know that he wrote a thesis paper on transcendentalism.
Oh, that's right. I always forget that. Right.
I'm sure he was also reading the Transcendentalist pals
So
like Hawthorne.
So he was an autodidact? Or he was taking this stuff in university?
Yeah, you can take electives.
A thesis? How did this go along with
Seminar
going
paper.
to be an engineer?
I don't know, but apparently they've got it at Wesleyan University where they have all of his papers, and someday I'd like to read it.
Frank Capra was a motherfucking intellectual.
He was.
I think that's as much as we need to say now, because we're going to also talk about a lot of this stuff in Meet John Doe.
We'll double back and talk about the double resonance when we get to Meet John Doe.
So, pretty much all of these films improved for me on this viewing, but not Forbidden.
Really?
Yeah, and I really liked it the first time I saw it, but I think it may have suffered from us having recently done Backstreet for an episode, because that's such a great movie, and this is Capra doing a weepie, and he's really not suited to it at all, and it becomes a real oddball film.
I don't think it's helpful to compare it to Backstreet.
It's really not. It wasn't helpful.
No, they're doing different things. On Letterboxd, I gave 5 stars to all of these movies except Forbidden, which I gave 4.5.
But all of the parts where it's trying to be like Backstreet, particularly at the end, it is falling so short of what Stahl achieved that it's embarrassing. But the parts where it's not trying to be Backstreet and it's just being its own weird thing are interesting.
What a great beginning to this film, too. You've got spring in New England. Flowers are out. The dogs are yawning. And Lulu has caught spring fever at long last.
So this is not like It's a Wonderful Life. I mean, in the Riskin films, there's often these speeches, really annoying speeches about longing for rural life and the small town. But Capra often fucking hates small towns and the life you have to lead in them. And this is one of those moments. And, you know, she is Mary the librarian. Or on her way to refusing to become that.
Exactly.
She's in the library.
No, this is obviously Capra's personal idea of hell for a woman.
No, but I think it's his personal idea of hell for himself because he has all of this erotic conflict.
Obviously, all the characters are himself.
Yes,
if he was
exactly.
a woman and he had to be a librarian, he would just kill himself, obviously.
Means if he was not able to resolve the conflict between his father love and his erotic life, and could not have an erotic life and an artistic life because the two are the same for him, then he would kill himself.
I mean, I'd love to be a librarian.
Fire to the whole town.
Seems like a great life, but no. Not in this town, because the whole town is waiting for her to slip up. We get this old man who's been waiting 8 years for her to show up late at the library so we could tease her about it. What a bunch of jackasses. No wonder she wants out of there. And she never comes back. She withdraws.
She tells him off good, just like at the beginning of Miracle Woman.
It's not as much of a Jeremiad, but she's not happy with them. She lets them know it. She withdraws her life savings and goes to Havana. Going to Havana,
where she didn't want to go on Ladies of Leisure, but here it's a good thing.
You just have to be in the right frame of mind for it. Doesn't it feel a little bit like a weird Now Voyager at first, too?
Sure, she's not a New England socialite, but...
She's a New England librarian.
Yeah.
And she takes her glasses off, though. I mean, she doesn't really do much more than that. It's not like a whole transformation the way the Bette Davis character does. And she doesn't have anyone helping her with it either.
She just needs an attitude shift, that's all.
Yeah, but it doesn't work at first. She looks incredible. She's on this boat, and everyone's remarking upon the fact that somehow there's still this librarian holdover casting a pall over her, and she can't seem to ever show up for dinner with anyone.
I've been in this exact position. I have gone to a bar. As a young, attractive woman, I have gone to a bar by myself and sat there and had a drink. Nobody approaches me. More than once.
Well, Henry Armetta and the rest of the staff of the boat are really disturbed by that. What is this boat coming to? Why is she only one? And like the...
Hey, you incels who think it's so easy to be a woman, who think it's so easy that all you have to do is be female, let alone slim and attractive. You have to be beating them off with a stick. Not true.
No, not always. For Lulu, nothing's working.
She has to meet a weirdo for it to work.
Yeah, so she runs out of the dining hall because she knows everyone's watching her and making fun of her for being unsuccessful romantically. She finds a guy sleeping in her bed, like Goldilocks. It's Adolphe Menjou, and we've seen him several times on our podcast, but this is the first time he's ever played someone likable, I think.
It's true. And he is very, very likable. You can see how he was actually a romantic star.
Well, actually, no, he was likable in Morocco as well.
Yeah, but he was cucked. He was in competition with Gary Cooper.
Right. Yeah, there's a difference between being a romantic object and being likable. But in this film, he's both.
Yes.
And it is believable. I was just saying last week that it didn't make sense for Hepburn to be into Adolphe Menjou, but here Stanwyck makes you believe he's only about 40. He's younger than us.
No, he's attractive and he's fun. He's really fun.
Yeah, he really is. I love him in this movie.
And he doesn't pull out a ventriloquist dummy or play the harmonica or any fucking thing.
No, but they do have their byplay with the masks, which is great.
The mask stuff, very Strindbergian, and yes, it was a lot of fun, yeah. I buy this. I'm into Adolphe Menjou.
So they have this wonderful time in Havana. They don't ask any questions of each other. They just embrace life. They gallop on the beach. There's great cinematography again. Joseph Walker giving it the transcendental treatment. Doing these things.
Oh yeah, they ride the horses on the beaches just like you're supposed to do. But it's all like a very quick montage.
It's a montage, yeah. They're back in New York. Well, she's never been in New York before. She settles there, presumably because they are getting involved, but they don't get married. It's not the usual progress of a relationship in 1932. So what's going on? She gets a job at a newspaper, and he's not told her his correct name.
Already they've got this backstreet relationship where she is giving him advice on how to win his cases, and he claims that he's taking it.
Meanwhile, Ralph Bellamy, looking like Hitler Youth. Isn't it fascinating the difference in the way Ralph Bellamy comes across in the early 30s from what he would later become as the premier unacceptable option in romantic comedies?
He's still an unacceptable romantic option.
But he's not usually threatening, and he's basically...
He's a big guy.
He always is, but he seems quite diminished when he is playing the big galoots in The Awful Truth and His Girl Friday.
Well, yeah, he's emasculated by his mother complex in those movies. Yeah, in this case, he's just a big, mean guy with a crush on Stanwyck.
He has only one weakness in life, and that's it, because other than that, he is focused laser-like upon taking over this newspaper and using it to hurt people, basically. That's what he wants to do with his life, and he is going to succeed.
He has a real animus against Adolphe Menjou because Menjou, as he's rising in political power, will not play ball with this newspaper.
Right, and it's presumably like the worst, most conservative newspaper in the city, and why would you want to be friends with them?
Bellamy surmises that it's the influence of the woman. There's a woman behind the scenes who is influencing him to have some principles.
Yeah.
Because he used to be more cooperative. So she's got her hand in that too.
And we have some interesting byplay between them, and we see that she is more than adequate to the task of fending off this guy, and he's a real handful, so it takes a practiced touch to get him away from you.
Well, as long as you're not alone with him, she's adequate to the task.
Yeah.
And even then, she's adequate to the task.
Yeah, exactly. No, he doesn't...
She just has to use more extreme means.
He doesn't get anywhere with her until she's so depressed that she allows things to happen later.
Well, no, that's strategic.
Yeah, exactly. Meanwhile, so we get the big scene, the revelation scene, where Menjou comes over with his mask on. This long comic scene together, and a lot of it's silent. Most of it's silent while they have the masks completely on. Ends with a flourish when he summons a large bouquet of flowers with the dumbwaiter.
Needless to say, there is nothing like this in Backstreet.
No.
There is no mutuality between those two at all.
This movie is interested in Menjou's emotions as well.
I guess, but it's just more important that it establishes a Capra-esque kind of relationship between these
they're having fun.
Yeah.
You don't really see Irene Dunne having all that much fun with John Bowles.
No, not at all.
As you say, he's just a horror figure.
Yeah, he just shows up again and again and again, and you want him to go away. Now, Menjou does become a bit horrifying, or the situation certainly does, although it's always Ralph Bellamy's fault.
Pretty much, yeah.
Because he's watching them. If he weren't there watching, they'd go on raising this child that she has.
The scene that we're talking about with the masks, she thinks it's an important night because she's going to tell him that she's pregnant. We see her looking at a picture of a baby before he gets there, so we know. And he thinks it's an important night because he's basically got to come around to telling her that he's married. And his real name is Robert Grover, and he's got this big political career.
He's saddled with an invalid wife now.
And she's a wonderful character, too.
Which is not from Backstreet, but it was reminiscent of that Japanese melodrama we watched, which was very good. Temptation, that's what it was called in our Setsuko Hara series. But the thing about this movie is that this is just like one little element in a plot that has 97 melodramatic elements in it. It's nuts. I guess the thing that interests me most about it is that it's this hybrid of a weepie and the kind of Capra movie we've seen before with, elements, some of the same elements in the Stanwyck character and some of the same elements in her relationship with Menjou. But then it also adds on this whole political intrigue thing that obviously gets blown up way more after Capra starts working with Riskin.
But what about the scene, speaking of your description of Backstreet as a horror movie, when he tracks her down and shows up at her house, the way she recoils, it's incredible when she answers the door and sees him?
Well, because we see her give birth to this child that she has decided to give up for adoption.
Well, she didn't, though, yeah.
I know, we don't see her make the decision to keep it, but the next thing we see is that I guess looks like 2 years have passed, or a year and a half or something, and she's got this little girl that she's taking care of. Then Menjou comes back, and yes, this is terrible because she's gotten over it and she's happy with her child. And then we do get into horror movie mode, which is that she ultimately ends up having to give up this child to his wife, which again, that would be another whole movie. You know? Like there's like about 10 movies in this movie.
It's also a newspaper comedy.
yeah, and the newspaper element that
she becomes the advice to the lovelorn.
Capra later develops more. Like that seems like it might have been the job that Stanwyck had in Meet John Doe. She's not like a really powerful player when we first meet her, as the Jean Arthur character always is.
Eventually...
They're old and gray-haired, which I guess means they're our age.
Well, they say 30 years, so she's probably in her mid-50s.
Jesus. She's just lightly frosted, though. Well, I mean, they do the same makeup, but not as well as Irene Dunn gets in Backstreet, where she ends up looking just lightly frosted, or starts out in the final sequence of looking lightly frosted, and then ends up looking 100 years old after her lover dies.
Yeah.
Anyway, but in this story, she has to marry Bellamy to somehow get him off the trail, or get him off the scent. I can't remember the exact plot details.
Yeah, exactly. That's why she does it.
He's going to expose Monjou, and she needs to distract him from this.
Yeah, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. And then he realizes why she married him, and he gets violent.
It's an amazing scene.
Now,
I think
of course,
some people don't like this.
No, this is the best scene in the movie. Watching this with the idea of thinking about this collaboration, and after seeing Ladies of Leisure and thinking about the interesting identification patterns in it, where the figure that we will call Frank Capra, the authorial figure, he is obviously so much more invested in the artist's subject. Like, more of his subjectivity is in that character than in the artist, whereas you would obviously expect it to be the other way around. To me, this just plays like, I'm gonna throw it out here, a fantasy of being Barbara Stanwyck killing her abusive husband so that they can be together.
I think so,
So
too.
there's more about their affair in this scene than there is in the whole Monjou and Stanwyck relationship.
Yeah, and we get to see the Stanwyck anger full force as she empties her gun into the sky.
Again and again and again.
Like Betty Davis in The Letter.
Like, this is not... Like, I was disturbed by this scene the first time. I was like, isn't that overkill for a guy who hit you once?
No.
This is like the reaction of a woman who's been hit a lot.
Yeah.
So it helps me to understand it in the way that I've devised.
And then the plot resolves it. She spends a year in jail and then gets her sentence commuted by Governor Monjou, and then he dies. He tries to make a clean breast of things by writing out a confession, and she destroys it as she leaves after he dies and walks off into the night, just like Stella Dallas.
I thought about that. I thought about Vidor maybe remembering this film, consciously or not.
And, you know, she also has a daughter who is getting married into the highest echelons
there's
of
also
society.
the Stella Dallas movie in this movie.
Yeah, it's got it all.
Too cluttered. It's just like there's too goddamn much going on.
Probably, but still a very worthwhile film. And it only suffers in comparison to the other movies we're talking about in this set. I still think in itself it's really something that you have to see.
Sure, worthwhile.
We'll move on to the final Columbia collaboration between Stanwyck and Capra, The Bitter Tea of General Yen.
So, of course, still for me of this first series, it's still the best for me.
Probably, but yeah, Miracle Woman is very, very, very good as well.
It's certainly a jump up in quality. It looks like a more expensive picture.
Production quality, sure. Yeah, he was getting bigger budgets by now.
And this was the one, apparently, where he decided he was going after an Oscar for the first time. Didn't work out that way.
1 year later, he got his Oscar.
For a film that he could not have expected getting it for.
Exactly.
But this was his first Oscar bid. Now, the novel it was based on, I have read this before, and I read it again, did not have what is the preeminent feature of this film, which is a romantic relationship or a love development between the Chinese warlord and the Christian missionary.
Really?
Really? This was all of that, which is the whole point of this movie, is the invention of Capra. Now, what it didn't have was a philosophical dialogue between the two of them about the pros and cons of their different cultures. So that's maintained in the movie, but the fact that it's then translated into an interracial love relationship that deals explicitly with racism makes it, of course, that much more interesting.
Now, we don't want to go making too grandiose claims for it on the sociological or political level, because a white man was cast as General Yen, and we should not forget that. That is fucked up.
It was a literal impossibility to do anything else at the time.
That doesn't mean that we're going to just say it's good. It's a great film, but this is not a good thing that they had to cast Niels Astor as General Yan. Now, he winds up being an amazing performer
It's
in the role.
Fantastic performance, and he wasn't an actor who, in the sound era, got a lot of chances to give a performance like this.
But I think it's always worth beginning with the fact that the production code would not have allowed them to do this movie if General Yan was actually being played by a Chinese actor. It just wouldn't have been made.
But you can have a real argument about that. Does that mean it would have been better to not make movies with this subject at all?
Yeah, you could.
Of course, the argument has been won in favor of, yes, you should make movies like this if this is the only way you can make them for me, but I am also a white chick.
Well, in 1933, it was the best that could be done. Now, we can condemn it. Why not?
Oh yes, now we can do better, so don't do this now.
No, definitely not. And don't say it was just fine because that's how everyone thought then. It was fucked up. And now we're going to talk about the movie. We start out with carnage.
Okay, yeah, so I don't completely understand the political background to this movie, so you're going to have to fill us in a little bit here, Dave. So the Civil War is between the communists and the not communists?
No.
Because that's what it says in some write-ups on the internet.
Yes, but it's a lot more complicated than that. The Civil War went on for 25 years. It intersected with a couple of wars with Japan and World War II in general.
Let's see, the novel is from, I think, 1930. So what's going on?
Society completely broke down in China in the mid-20s. And yes, you have the Red Army coalescing around a dream of turning China socialist. But you also have many different factions vying for control of the state, some of which are aligned with each other at some times and fighting each other at other times. You have these warlords, right? General Yan is one of them. It's not so simple as there's communists fighting capitalists.
What is a warlord? At this point in history, what makes you a warlord, and what does that involve?
Again, I am no historian of China. I have taken a couple of courses 25 years ago on Chinese history, introductory courses.
I'm no historian of anything.
You have this peasant army Mao is assembling, and then you have aristocrats, traditional aristocrats who wield a lot of power still in a basically feudal society. China, from the 1800s onward, was kind of operating in a state of semi-vassalage to various European powers, especially the British. It wasn't formally annexed. There were only little cities that were actually part of the British Empire, and Macau was part of Portugal, etc., etc. But the whole country and the emperor and empress, they weren't able to do anything they wanted. They had to get the okay of the British powers, or else they were going to get invaded, like in the Opium Wars, gunboat diplomacy. When they tried to do things the British didn't like, British sailed gunships up the different rivers and killed people. And it's a state struggling to emerge from a semi-colonial status. The European powers that had been really keeping a lockdown on things were exhausted from World War I. And you just get this total disintegration. And it's not clear to anyone, I don't think, at this time, who was going to emerge victorious and what side anyone was on. And obviously this is fictional, but General Yan seems to be one of these aristocrats who is vying for hegemonic position on the anti-communist side.
Did they just all have their private armies?
Yes.
And where did they get them from? Feudal vassals?
Yeah, basically.
So vassals are just a lower tier of aristocrat.
Yeah, exactly. So
but they all hate each other.
It wasn't very dissimilar.
Because this becomes a source of the intrigue in the movie. So in some ways, although this is Capra's answer to Shanghai Express, it's more like the Scarlet Empress.
Yeah, we don't ever hear the communists mentioned in this film, and they may be involved. They may be that army that steals the money at the end. They may not.
They are involved, apparently, in the novel.
Right. Because, different aristocrats, just because you're an aristocrat doesn't mean you can't side with a peasant army. And maybe...
Well, that would be quite interesting if actually... If Ma Li was actually on the communist side, that would be quite interesting, and that actually makes sense of her character.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, but it's not stated in the film.
No.
Stanwyck doesn't understand enough about the politics, and by extension, the audience doesn't. It's not made clear to us exactly what the ideological stakes here are. It's pure power politics as far as...
No, but it's made clear in the movie that Ma Li gives no shits about missionaries, and Capra does seem sympathetic to that, and that this is class-based. she is a slave, and it would make sense for her to be, trying to work against General Yen in a way that would be ultimately freeing for her and her class of people.
Exactly. That's the fan fiction that I've come up with all this time for it, and if it's in the novel, all the better. But it's not stated anywhere in this movie. But General Yen, his advisor, Walter Connolly, who plays Jones, his dream is that General Yen will become the guy that becomes the face of anti-communism in China. And if everyone rallies around him, then he will put down Mao and unify China and maybe make it a semi-modern state.
But of course, quite a lot like Dietrich's character in Dishonored, he decides that he will give up all of this power for love.
The last thing you want to say about the socio-political context of the time is that in the early 30s, China is a failed state at this time. Not in any way a viable national unit. Everyone around them is starting to make decisions that are going to make it even worse, right? Like Japan sees this. Japan is fresh from a bunch of victories against European countries in different wars, and they're like, that's it. Well, we're going to get in on this. If China's going to collapse, we're going to take over as much of it as we can. They move into Manchuria in, I think, the early 30s, so right around this time. And of course, that just makes it even crazier.
For which see our Setsuko Hera series. Alright, that's good enough for the political context. Oh, but then into the mix of all of this come missionaries.
Yeah, well, they've always been there, right? And there's a range of approaches that Capra takes to these characters.
He does not, I don't know what Capra's feelings about organized religion were, but he is not sympathetic to their mission.
No, not at all.
But it's subtle. It's relatively subtle, because the character is taken seriously, but by the end of the film, a moral lesson has definitely been delivered to her. Watching Bitter Tea of General Yen going straight into the overtly Christian-themed Meet John Doe, it was very interesting to have some of the same ideas thrown around at the end about whether substantial sacrifice is necessary to back up the words and the message of Christianity.
Yeah.
When are these ideas hollow and when are they live?
Yeah, I think that that's a good distinction. And we see a range of embodiments of that in the European characters that we meet. Most of the ones that we meet at the beginning are just reprehensible creeps and racists.
Oh, that was very interesting. I thought that was fascinating. I guess he's a missionary?
Well, he's the bishop. Yeah, so he's basically I don't know what, I mean, I guess they're probably Episcopal or Anglican, right? Because who else has bishops? I don't know, Methodists would have bishops too.
The bishop telling his little fable about how Mongolian bandits, how they took the wrong message from the Christian story. And then he underlines it by saying, and that's China. That's just all of China. And then, is it a camera movement or a cut to the face of a Chinese man? And it's impossible to know whether to read it as the conventional reading would be, oh, look at this enigmatic Chinese man who's capable of anything, whose motivations are beyond our comprehension. But it also plays as, here is an actual Chinese person listening to this garbage.
Yeah.
But it could be either, and that's and at this point in the film, you don't know which it is.
So all of these people seem to be almost purely hypocrites. They are not really there to do anything that even they would mistake for good. They are there to live high on the hog in a war-torn country where they can extort wealth from it without actually giving anything back. Whereas Dr. Strike, Gavin Gordon, who is engaged to Megan Davis, he seems to actually be trying to do some good in the country, despite the fact that I think ultimately we will come to see him as a fairly misguided and ineffectual romantic partner.
Well, the problem, of course, being, and Molly is an example because she was raised in a missionary school, the problem being that the price that the missionaries extort for rescuing orphans, for example, is that they are then to be converted against their will, having another culture forced on them, imperialism, etc., etc.
The film, it brings Megan Davis into the equation on the side of the Gavin Gordon faction. She is someone that immediately shows us that she's not just there to go to tea parties and pretend nothing's happening. She wants to go into the heart of the inferno.
She wants to do good as she sees it. She is a typically misguided, of the type we often talk about on the podcast, 19th century novel heroine.
Yeah.
She's a reformer. She's a Dorothea Brooke.
Yeah, she hasn't seen this guy she's going to marry in 3 years. They were childhood sweethearts. She comes from one of the best old Puritan families in New England, we're told.
You just gotta roll with the Stanwyck Brooklyn accent. She's just always gonna talk this way, like Jimmy Stewart and whatever the hell he sounds like. Cary Grant, all of them.
Before she even gets to the party, she has her meeting with General Yen, and it's quite a shocking meeting. She is in a rickshaw, and the guy that is trying to pull it gets stalled or something, and he's trying to get it arranged, and while he's working on that, he gets run over by a car.
And lo and behold, rickshaw boy lives don't matter.
No, not to any of the authorities here on either side of the divide. Europeans don't care, and Chinese officials don't care.
And it's considered absurd that she would make any kind of fuss about this.
And again, that's the way the film presents it to us.
And of course, we are at this point on her side of Christian's perspective. This is a terrible thing.
Yeah, and so she wants an answer from him. She wants this rich guy to do something about this poor person who may be dying on the street. And he says, oh, if he's dying, he's better off out of all of this.
I mean, it is true that they are rescuing orphans and worrying about people in hit and runs. Well, people are dying all around them in droves.
Just indiscriminate machine gunning. That's how it seems anyway. Now, obviously, there must be some principle at work in terms of how you're going about the street fighting.
It's a country in chaos. And then they have their little exchange over handkerchiefs.
Yeah, so she reaches out to him because he's been hurt a little bit. He's got a scratch on his forehead from this collision, and she wants to help him. And he is touched by this, or what? Maybe not touched, but he is astounded that a European woman will reach out to try to touch someone who's not European. He just hasn't seen this before.
Okay, you think that's the basis of this exchange?
Of course.
Okay.
Now, obviously, he has no inferiority complex or anything.
He does. We see that he does. Definitely white supremacy at work in this movie.
He's mostly bemused. He's like, what is this weird creature? Why is she doing this? They're not supposed to do this. That's as far as it goes.
When she acts virulently racist towards him, he is definitely offended.
Well, he's offended, but he's patronizing. He thinks it's stupid.
Well, we'll talk about it more when we get there. But already, what I found fascinating is that already when he gets into the car and she follows him with her eyes, it's clear that she's attracted to him right away.
That's their meet cute. I mean, it's one of the most horrific meet cutes ever committed to celluloid, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
Each of them will linger in each other's minds after this brief encounter, and will be very important later on, obviously. Then we go to the heart of the inferno, as they call it. It turns out that, again, General Yen is going to be key. He's the one that controls this sector. If Dr. Strike, our groom-to-be, is going to get to the orphanage and make it out alive with these kids, he has to get a safe passage letter.
You know what I find interesting is that I've seen this film discussed online very frequently as an example of a horrifyingly racist film. Or alternately as campy and kitsch, or both. And not because Nils Astor is in makeup, but because of the racial stereotypes of the dream sequence that we'll talk about when we get there.
No, well, that's the least racist thing in the movie.
But this movie is more sophisticated about racist attitudes than any movie of the era that I've seen, and probably most movies, at least made by white people now.
Probably, yeah.
It's just astounding, the level of sophistication for the era, and we know that this is a theme that continues in Capra's work because we saw it in Lost Horizon. Whatever else he was not racist.
Sure, he had many blinkers when it came to
what I mean is
racialized peoples.
Not racist in the general way that people were racist at the time. He is thinking about white supremacy. Nobody was doing this in Hollywood films at the time. Almost.
And you get an incredibly fun scene, actually, in the midst of all this, where Gavin Gordon muscles his way in to see General Yen. He only gets in there because the general is not supposed to be in the city, and it could become a problem if it gets around. So they have to placate this guy But the general can't even really... He just wants this guy out of his hair, and he figures he may as well kill him off by giving him a fake letter, which is...
Well, he threatens to expose the general, which
he does,
is not smart.
Well, again, this is where he is making use of the political capital that Europeans were used to wielding in China.
Sure.
And I think it was getting to be less and less of a factor at this point.
So the general writes, as you say, the fake letter in Chinese, which the missionary cannot read.
Still can't read Chinese, doctor? And he's like, no, not yet. So he just writes out this thing, and we get a little dissolve that shows us what it says in English. This fool prefers civil war to the embrace of his wife, or of his bride.
I don't know a thing about Chinese culture, but what General Yen represents in this movie, which is called Chinese culture, is Epicureanism.
Sure.
Is basically an atheist approach to life that is nevertheless philosophical and about living for pleasure and accepting what you can't do anything about.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's the kind of character that you could get in Henry James' novel as a European sophisticate.
Exactly.
Who happens to be the ruler of a part of a state, which you don't usually get.
Powerful person,
yeah.
Yes.
James doesn't usually talk about those kinds of characters.
Possessing absolute power over a small group of people.
A province.
Well, actually, the characters in the Golden Bowl are getting close to that.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Maggie and her father.
Yeah.
Maggie and Adam. Fantastically rich, and they can buy people.
Strike represents the ethical to the exclusion of all else, and, as you say, the aesthetic life. General Yen.
But he doesn't even do that well, because we were talking about that in terms of Ninotchka, and it's a theme that Billy Wilder revisits in A Foreign Affair, but the ethical life is what comes in for scrutiny here. I think the movie, its baseline is that obviously the philosophy of the general is not acceptable. What he does, his life, is not acceptable, but do the missionaries actually have anything better to offer? That is what's being scrutinized.
Yeah, and they don't. No, I think that what the film is saying probably is that General Yen would be great if he wasn't the ruler of a province and didn't have to make decisions about life and death over people.
There really isn't a lot that he can do about this. This is just sort of his lot in life. That's the way it's presented in the movie, anyway.
Yeah, he didn't aspire to it. He's not a self-made
if
general.
If he was an idealist, I guess he could join the communists, but the communists were mostly people who were powerless.
Yeah, it was a peasant army.
Exactly. So he really doesn't have options here.
No.
The poor guy.
They go into the war-torn area, they get the orphans, and when they are confronted by soldiers, they give them the letter, they have a good laugh over it. They don't get executed right away, but they're not going to get safe passage. They're not going to get any protection from soldiers, so that's not looking good. Against all odds, they kind of make it most of the way to where they need to go, right until they happen to have a public confrontation with one guy who gets angry that they bumped into him, and he starts hitting people with his stick. Dr. Strike gets knocked out. Megan gets knocked out. She's the one that isn't in the vehicle yet, so she's just left behind and liable to be trampled.
Yeah, that's what we think is going to happen, but
instead, she wakes up on a troop transport train with General Yen and Ma Li.
This is, of course, a remarkable scene where, at the end of it, after discussion about how he has saved her, and she's going to have to stay with him until he can get her back to her friends. After all of that, there is this exchange of looks between the three of them sleeping in the small compartment, where Stanwyck sees Ma Li ministering.
And she registers all of this because she actually does the thing with the pillow at the end of the movie, right?
Yep, what I want to talk about. Puts together that they are in an erotic relationship where the woman is submissive.
Yeah.
And obviously she, as an American woman, disapproves of this, but at the same time she's fascinated by it. And Molly sees the general looking at Megan and also understands that something's going to happen there. And at this point we don't know if she has any personal feelings for him or not. We find out that she doesn't.
Right.
But at this point, it might seem that she would feel, if not jealous, then at least threatened in some way.
Sure.
But really, it's just a scene of an exchange of knowledge between the characters.
Yeah.
More than anything else.
And it ends with Megan Davis pulling down her dress to cover her leg.
Hides her legs.
Yeah. She seems to think that that's the thing to do at that moment. And that's partly because he is looking at her, and partly because she is suffering from a lot of delusions about what non-white men want to do to white women.
Yeah, but she's also already very sexually interested in this non-white man. Not having seen the movie in many years, I was surprised that her sexual fantasy occurs like on her first night that she's there. Well, I don't know if it's her first night, but it's very early in her stay. It's practically the next thing we see.
Well, sure, because she's interested in him from the moment she offers him her handkerchief.
And then, so we get this... First of all, it's just very interesting that a movie written by a man would contain, and this was written by...
Edward Paramore.
Yes, and Capra, presumably. Because obviously nothing like this was in the novel, which was written by a woman.
Yeah, he's also the guy that wound up with the final screenwriting credit on Three Comrades. And I think he wrote most of it because F. Scott Fitzgerald worked on it, but...
That's a good screenplay.
Yeah, it's great. And F. Scott Fitzgerald, apparently, not much of what he wrote is in that film because he just couldn't write screenplays.
Can you think of any other example of a woman having an erotic fantasy in a movie of this time?
Of any kind of erotic fantasy?
Any kind of erotic fantasy at all. Can you? I can't.
Going Hollywood, I think Marion Davies has erotic fantasies about Bing Crosby.
What? Okay, but what do they is it an erotic fantasy?
Well, I haven't seen that movie in 20 years.
Is it investigating her sexual subjectivity in the way that this scene is?
Well, she's kind of daydreaming about him, yeah. It's not as charged as this, but it's something that came to mind.
Anyway, this surrealistic dream sequence is not like anything Capra ever did again.
Not exactly, no.
It anticipates, I don't know where he's getting it from, obviously some German expressionist films or something, and there's a Nosferatu homage, I guess.
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
To me, it mostly, in its filming style, resembles stuff that Cocteau would be doing, but not for over a decade.
Yeah, because it's not Sternberg. Sternberg doesn't have fantasy
he doesn't
sequences.
have anything like that, no. But neither does Capra, so it's very interesting. Megan has a fantasy in which the general is pounding down her door and then breaking it down, gets into her room, kind of starts as a rape fantasy. He is this hideous monster.
He's basically just depicted like a pulp magazine Yellow Peril villain.
Yeah, but he is a monster.
That's how they were drawn, yeah.
Monstrous image. And
Fu Manchu
has these incredibly long fingernail claws, and then he kind of grasps her with them. And that made me think that could Polanski have been thinking about this when he does the surrealistic devil rape fantasy in Rosemary's Baby, because it resembles it in some ways. But then a hero arrives in Western clothing wearing a mask. Is it a mask, or is it just his face is obscured by the hat?
No, it's a mask.
There is a mask.
But it's only over the eyes, yeah.
Right?
Not a COVID mask.
Haha, over the eyes. Rescues her from this terrible yellow monster, and she pulls off his mask, and we expect it to be her fiance, but no, it is General Yen westernized.
It's General Yen the way he looks. Yeah.
No. He's specifically westernized. I think that's important because when she actually sees him in real life a moment later and does not act in any way friendly or attracted toward him, he is wearing very Eastern clothing. And I think the idea here is that if he could only be a little more like a Western man, she would find him more acceptable.
But most of the time he is wearing Western-ish garb because he's wearing a military uniform.
But not for the rest of the film.
Right. No, I guess that's true. So yeah, I mean, that right there is the ultimate, from the 30s anyway, deconstruction of...
I think it might still be the ultimate, at least by white writers. But still, this can't translate to her behavior in reality.
No, she says all kinds of reprehensible things to him early on in this movie. Now, we don't lose complete sympathy for her, although the way that she chooses to verbalize her criticisms of him are reprehensible.
I was surprised that, even though this was a white actor in makeup, I was surprised that there were kissing scenes in the fantasy.
Well, yeah.
And I'm sure that is part of what caused the backlash when it was released.
Sure. No, that was,
romantic Hollywood movie kissing scenes.
A difficult thing to get across in that context. And yes, it would not have been permitted, even in the pre-code era, to have an actual Chinese actor kissing Barbara Stanwyck, even only in a dream sequence. They would not have allowed that.
This actually does take place, the fantasy sequence, after the scene when they're alone together, and she actually treats him as a rape threat and calls him a yellow swine. At that moment, she clearly thinks that for this whole first part of the story, when she arrives at the palace, the whole first part of her stay in the palace, she keeps thinking she's in a different story than the one she's actually in. She keeps thinking she's in different novels.
Yeah.
And in this moment, she thinks that she is the white heroine threatened with rape by the evil yellow man who can't control his lust. She picks up a letter knife to stab him or herself with, as the heroine would in such a novel, but that's not even the scene at all.
No, and it's always clear to us that that's not part of how General Yen operates. But
not with women who are his guests, anyway.
the thing about this scene as well is that she's actually angry at him because he is mass executing his prisoners. That's the first thing that she learns when she wakes up. And
which is fair.
no, but what I think is really fascinating is that, yes, that's what she is irate about, and his blasé attitude about it, although he does give his reasons.
Like a really amazing movie or novel aesthete, his reaction to her ethical horror is to tell them to move away so that they don't bother the nice white lady with their dying noises.
Yeah, which is still the way a lot of problems are handled in our world. As long as we don't hear about it.
As long as the nice white people don't hear about it,
exactly.
It's fine. Just move it away.
But again, this is the crucial turning point in that scene. That's what she's angry about. That's what she wants to scream at him about. And he's deflected her on that. And she reaches for this feeble weapon, which is racism. That's when it turns into exactly what you're saying. And I think you're right about all of that. I'm just saying that it is a deflection of the argument that she wanted to have, that she is not really adequate to have, and she falls back on this thing that's even less adequate.
Of being racist and accusing him of being a rapist.
You can see it on her face. She's ashamed of herself as she does all of this melodramatic stuff, which is fascinating, and it wouldn't be shot that way in most movies, obviously.
Yeah, this is definitely Stanwyck's most complex character to date in the Capra movies.
Right, because Capra wants you to see that this is beneath her. This is pathetic that she's reached for racial epithets when they could be arguing about the ethics of killing prisoners.
She's perhaps less of the hero of the movie than he is. She is the one who has to learn a lesson.
Yeah, I think so.
It's a great role, and she does a great job with it. She is playing a role. She isn't doing her usual Stanwyck thing, and she's not availing herself of her anger tools. It's a more mature performance than we've seen before.
That's the setup, and it basically becomes a tug of war between the two of them, like a romantic comedy as well, I suppose you could say, although again, a very strange romantic comedy with not too many laughs.
So this is what prompted me to start talking about the movie's attitudes to race. It's certainly not just shown in that fantasy sequence. Also her relationship with Mali, where she keeps expecting that there's going to be some kind of solidarity between them simply, and again, she's mistaking the novel she's in, some kind of solidarity between them just because they're women. Whereas, of course, Molly feels absolutely no solidarity with a white woman and has no reason to.
That's right.
She has her own reasons for doing her own things in her own country, and this woman is nothing more than a nuisance, if even that, or a tool to be used if she can. Megan is acting like these two are going to be best friends and help each other out of scrapes. And she actually offers friendship to her.
She's also hoping that she will get something out of the bargain as well, which is that she wants Mali to deliver all these letters out to Dr. Strife.
Well, that's exactly it, because she's not actually offering friendship. She assumes that this woman is going to have a sort of servile role with her.
Yeah.
Based on the fact that her white woman feelings, and needs come first.
Toshia Mori is the actress.
Japanese actress.
Yes. And she's amazing in those scenes, too. Like, she's not even trying to pretend that they're... She's
but
like,
she doesn't need to.
Okay.
Because Megan's in her fantasy world, and she doesn't need any kind of encouragement.
And then we see Molly just walk down to General Yen and hand over another letter and some more jewelry that's supposed to pay for the letter. And
she's loaded down with jewelry. What the hell does she need Megan's jewelry for? It's like Megan has read too many novels. Well, dime novels.
I don't think Megan is bribing her with that. She thinks that they're friends or something like it. And Molly is going to use the ring to pay for the transportation of the letter out to the city.
Sure, but still, this is ridiculous. This is something that she read about in a novel.
Yeah, well, exactly. So around about now, we start to get more scenes with Jones, Walter Connolly. the financial advisor, and we get some talk about the kind of dire situation that is developing. It's kind of a make or break time for General Yen.
He's an interesting character, isn't he? He's such a disgusting sleaze, but then at the end he becomes a sort of philosopher.
Walter Connolly, he's one of my favorite 30s actors. He pops up in so many good movies. We just saw him in It Happened One Night as well as the dad, trying to get Claudette Colbert to eat.
Right.
Have some of this steak. It's a poem. He's a very different character in this one. He is a hard-nosed businessman who has yoked his fortune to General Yen. We learn at the end that he actually was kind of in love with General Yen.
It's true.
But he doesn't talk like that during the actual time that the general's alive.
General Yen is a very glamorous guy.
He is.
He's cool. He's cool, not like David Manners.
Yeah, that's a real contrast, right? Most of these Capra guys are pulling out their dummies, and General Yen is just smoking out of a cigarette holder.
Thinking about women
appraisingly.
looking like fruit trees.
Yeah, very cool dialogue. What it becomes is a more refined version of the ethical versus aesthetic debate. And again, as you say, what Yen is trying to do is get Megan to think about the ethical in a more expansive way and take off the missionary blinder she's been wearing, her weird little protected apolitical life.
This whole plot with Molly, after she actually catches Molly in what initially looks like a romantic intrigue with
Captain Lee.
Right, with Captain Lee. Then they seem for the moment to be on more of a reciprocal footing. She learns that Walter Connolly is there, another American, so she might be able to get something out of him and get some help from him, assuming a solidarity that doesn't exist. It later becomes active, but not for as long as he is attached to General Yen. American solidarity, one tier down in his list of priorities. She agrees to come to dinner, and this is another fascinating thread that runs through the movie. We get this whole, now this is a real, not like in Forbidden. This is a real Now Voyager makeover sequence where she gets to pick out a gorgeous dress and
powder and paint.
And noticeably, she's given two choices while she's in her bath being attended to by slaves. And she chooses the flashier dress. Right? So this is Megan's repressed side, obviously. And then she puts on the paint that she's provided with. But the thread running through the movie from her first seeing Molly tend to the general through this sequence and all the way to his death scene where she comes to him in this outfit, kind of like the reverse of Julie and Jezebel coming to press in the white dress he wanted her in too late.
Right.
She's still stuck in this fantasy in her head of coming to General Yen sexually, and her own expression of her sexuality means becoming a whore, becoming a concubine, right? And I think that's why he won't accept her sexual offer at the end. Because she's still stuck in a fantasy version of their relationship that's kind of an inadequate expression of what she's feeling. And she's sobbing like to lose her virginity under these circumstances would be a tragic sacrifice, and he can't do it.
It's hard to say. He might have gone for it if he was planning to continue to live.
Well, yeah, he can't do it and then kill himself.
Right.
But part of it, if she had been coming to him in a way that was more loving and sensual, but she comes to him like, here I am, I'm being a whore for you, take me, like, and sobbing the whole time. Like, you can't think that the way that she comes to him and the way that she makes herself up for him like that is supposed to be a good or authentic expression of sexuality. It's not.
Well, I don't know.
That's why there is this whole thread, I believe.
I think you can read it a lot of different ways, and I think that it is multivalent, really, because I do think that she
loves him, she's trying, but what I'm saying is that she doesn't get all the way even at the end. Not even close.
That's true, and she's just got complicated feelings about sex in general.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Not just about sex with General Yen, but about anyone.
Yes, absolutely. And it's just this whole sort of kind of discovering her own eroticism through her attraction to a man of another race is what brings out this whole complex in her that we see and these complicated feelings.
Yeah, and so she dresses up, puts on all that makeup, then we see her take it all off.
And she puts on her gross, disgusting dress.
That's a less. Then she sits through this horrifying dinner where Jones exposes the conspirators in their midst.
Yeah, the Scarlet Empress scene.
Yeah, it all ends with Mali on the execution block, or about to be. And here, Megan feels like this is her moment to shine. She is going to show everyone the way.
So as awful as everyone is behaving, who is not Megan, her interventions to date have amounted to telling people to act nicer. So it hasn't been very helpful.
No, but here, she does save someone's life.
Yeah, after a big speech about acting nicer.
Yeah, and forgiveness, the power of forgiveness. Now, of course,
mercy. And
yeah. Especially when you're forgiving someone that really doesn't deserve it. That's normally the preserve of God, and here you've got a chance to do it.
Like, as he says to her later, what she's relying on is that she looks nice, she's attractive, and she's going to deliver this nice speech, and the two of them together are somehow going to make an impression on him. And this is not all about saving Mali's life. This is a lot about how much power do I have to deliver this message.
But again, a lot of this also is General Yen. He is, as you say, maybe even for a change, the person that Capra is more interested in.
Yeah.
And General Yen probably does want to die, probably does want an end to all this strife.
Well, I thought this was fascinating because I think, despite the fact that he knows she's a hypocrite and can't put her actions where her words are, her speech actually, I think, does reach him and makes him realize that he is completely, because he loves her, I mean, also for that reason, but actually does reach him and make him feel like this life he's been leading is disgusting and he doesn't want to do this anymore.
It's not like he thinks she has a way forward that will work in a civil war, but I do think that he just doesn't want to live anymore. There's no way to make good choices.
Well, he's the Capra suicide in this movie.
Yes, he is. So that's how she reaches him, not by giving him a new lease on life or any sort of new code of conduct that he will adhere to and it will bring joy to his existence. But
well, no one ever gets a new code of... The suicide never gets a new code of conduct. Maybe they can be convinced to live for other reasons.
But in this context, I think Capra probably does feel like, you know, any good person would just want to kill themselves or get out of this situation.
Well, that's the first thing he says when we meet him.
Yeah.
Any sane person would be better off dead in this situation.
I think I probably agree.
So now that he's decided to die, he's made up his mind, he is going to die.
Teach her a lesson.
He's going to die by playing out this chess game with her.
And hopefully he will impact her in some way.
Yeah.
That's the best he can hope for at this point. Now he's really going to disappoint his friend Jones, who thinks that they have a real chance to run China if they just keep on the path, but he just gives up. Obviously he knows. And he's counting on the fact that Mali is going to betray them, and he is going to lose his army, and it all plays out exactly as expected.
So I only thought about it as I said it, as we were doing the podcast, but this is the one film where, because of the particular historical political setting, even though he's maybe not interested in the details, Capra actually gets to play out the suicide.
Yeah.
All the way to the end, and what that might mean if you actually went through with the decision, well, now that you've decided to die, what are you going to do with the rest of your life?
He makes a deal with Megan. Okay, you want to be responsible for Mali? Fine. We'll let her live. We'll see what happens. I'm telling you, it's not going to go well.
And she finds out that Mali went to missionary school and is now making noises about Christianity and how much she loves it and gives her a big hug. And so she takes all this at face value and just assumes, yes, my people are doing good work here and she is a product of it. And having her in my charge is all going to work out great.
And we have this amazing scene where they go to the temple, and the temple is just a meeting place for conspirators. Probably communists, right? The People's Revolt.
I don't know why Captain Lee is involved with it then, though. Because he is the son of aristocrats.
Well, yeah, but minor aristocrats, right, who owed allegiance to General Yen. Maybe they just figure, well, the tide is changing. We're going into a brave new world, and maybe we can get a position of power in Mao's government if we make deals with them. I don't know. Or maybe they're not communists at all. We don't know. But anyway, the temple is on their side, and the message is relayed. It's a coded message, and Megan Davis just sits there smiling, thinking that this is a regular old church gathering.
And again, somehow we understand, with none of the risk in hitting you over the head and spelling it out, somehow we understand through all of this that Megan is... It's not a sign of Megan's goodness that she trusts Mao Li. It's a sign of her own complacency, her own sense of self.
Yeah, it's sanctimoniousness.
And again, living in a fantasy. Like, just completely delusional. Whatever she thinks is the way things are, or the way they're going to be.
I knew she'd be a good girl. Yeah, she keeps saying that, right? Like about Mao Li, and Mao Li is
Well,
just...
what a good girl means is being pliant and being the way that she wants her to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Mao Li has this amazing smile on her face as she chants this prayer that is going to reveal the exact location of all the generals' worldly funds and end this war for General Yen anyway.
Megan can't imagine that anybody kind of exists outside of her own imagination and set of needs and has their own set of needs that they are going to accomplish. So she is just a very immature young woman who has set herself the mission of saving people's souls and lives, and
without having a fully formed soul herself.
And she's in over her head, and this is the lesson that she is going to get.
Yeah, and that's how basically what General Yen says to her at the end when he accuses her of not having the wisdom needed to back up her schemes.
Yeah, so yes, it is a lesson in humility, among other things.
Oh, it most certainly is. Everything goes to hell. It's an interesting movie because it has these kind of exciting or horrifying action sequences in the middle of all of this. I guess Shanghai Express has that a little bit too. So it's kind of going.
I don't really remember, to be honest.
But that...
I don't think so.
Troop transport hijack is quite an exciting piece of action filmmaking from Capra.
Sure. No, I don't think Sternberg has any action filmmaking at all.
No, I guess there's just interrogation sequences, but not really fighting.
Lots of scenes of lots of people standing around, lots of extras, but...
So all of that happened. I mean, it's pretty great. Walter Connolly is there. He's got, like, this intimation that things are about to go to hell, and he tries to get the train out of there, but he gets there too late.
What am I talking about? There is an action sequence in Sternberg, which is... Well, it's just a mob scene at the end of The Last Command.
Well, and I guess Marlene Dietrich has her gallop at the end of The Scarlet Empress.
Is that an action sequence? A horse running up a staircase? For Sternberg it is.
Yeah, Walter Connolly left alone, all the trains gone. That's amazing. He just walks up to the tracks and he's like scratching his head. Well, I guess we're fucked now. It's crazy.
It's always great, as General Yen does here, it's always great to see somebody die well in a movie. Which means stylishly.
Well, he sure does. Looks quite relieved when he finds out that he's got no more money. When Megan Davis is summoned to his chamber...
She thinks she is going to be effectively raped.
Yeah, she's still got that at the forefront of her mind now.
That's because she's thinking about sex with him all the time.
What she put up in exchange for Mao Li's loyalty was a night of sex with her.
And she already pretty much wants to give that.
Yeah.
So it's not much of a sacrifice.
General Yen is like, no. It was your life you put up. He is dressing her down over her lack of wisdom and then talking about her beauty. And then he embraces her and says that he was coming to her room to kill her.
Well, kill them both.
Sure, of course, but kill her first. Obviously, he doesn't want to do any of that anymore. He doesn't even blame her anymore. He just thinks it's all pathetic and sad.
There is a shot where, as he's saying all this to her while embracing her, she's crying over his shoulder, and you can see that for a moment she gives in and feeling love for him, but then she rushes away again.
It's an amazing scene, and his voice breaks right at the perfect moment when he says he was going to kill her.
Nils Astor is so incredible in this movie.
Yeah.
And he is a damn handsome man.
Final scene where he actually drinks the bitter tea. As you say, she comes to him in the finery.
In her concubine outfit.
Kneels before him, and he drinks the tea, and they never get to consummate their love.
They never even have an actual kiss, just the fantasy kiss.
Yeah, that's the best they can do.
Hey man, it's Kathy and Heathcliff.
In the final coda, she is on a barge headed back to the city.
Yeah, very Queen Christina-esque, but are they the same year? When is Queen Christina?
33, yeah, same year.
Okay. This was
January 33, yeah.
So hey, maybe Mamoulian saw it.
She doesn't speak at all. Walter Connolly does all the speaking in this final scene.
Well, she's processing the shit out of shit.
She communicates a lot with her face, obviously, but
a lot more than Garbo.
All the talking is done by Walter Connolly as he muses on the possible afterlife of General Yen and speculating that they may all meet again someday. Now,
And it's very interesting because he is this kind of really disgusting character, but he sees them all as meeting again someday in the afterlife.
And I don't think Stanwyck is thinking that. I think she's thinking about what a terrible world this is and how it presented her with this opportunity that really couldn't be made good upon because of the limitations that are imposed upon the Western mind, basically.
I don't know, though. In a way, it's like Four Daughters, in that you have a young, inexperienced girl who meets this incredibly complicated man who introduces ideas into her life that she would never otherwise have had, and she loses him, and she has gained maturity from it, and she may even be, in a completely different comparison, reminded me of the end of a Flannery O'Connor story, which almost all end the same way, is that after this ordeal, she may actually be taking the first baby steps on the road to wisdom. May actually now turn out to be the great soul that she wanted to be.
Well, hopefully.
It's a possibility for her now. Certainly not like Priscilla Lane. She's not going to now go back and be like, oh, thank God that's over, and marry the missionary, but actually that is held out as a possibility by Walter Connolly. She could do either, he thinks.
Yeah, but he says, I don't think you'll marry Strike.
But then he says you might marry him after all.
Yeah, and we're left to ponder that. There was no sequel.
So is this Flannery O'Connor, or is it Four Daughters? Who knows?
Meet John Doe.
So I knew that Capra had made some wartime propaganda films for the U.S. Army.
The Why We Fight series.
After Pearl Harbor, although I don't think I've ever seen them, or any of them. Maybe I did, way back in the day. But I stumbled on a fact that I didn't know just yesterday, which is that his style in some of these films was inspired by Leni Riefenstahl, presumably The Will to Power.
Well, the whole idea was Capra was going to create the counter propaganda to Leni Riefenstahl.
And I don't know when he started thinking about this, but this film already looks like it owes a debt to Riefenstahl, and that film, and Will to Power in particular. It's certainly one of the ideas behind it, which means, by the way, it looks gorgeous, but it's an example of fascist aesthetics. Not in the same way as when we talked about Beau Travail. What I mean is that there's an attention to the beauty of the image. There are lots of crowd scenes. There are actual scenes of a rally that looks like it could be a Hitler rally. You know, the John Doe convention at the end. There's a monumentality to the way that the characters are filmed at certain points, the actors are filmed at certain points, that all of which made me think of that. And also just this idea that, this kind of weird and confused idea at the center of the film that you could restart Christianity with a manufactured Christ, and then political party could come along and hijack this and turn him into Hitler. Like, that's basically the idea behind the film in a nutshell.
Well, not turn him into Hitler, but turn him into Hitler. Turn
him into a populist figurehead for a fascist party.
He would be the ballyhoo man for Hitler, right? Because he would just be saying, okay, vote for D.B. Norton.
No, but he's a manufactured populist, and Hitler was an actual populist. So
Sure.
He is the Hitler analog.
We should situate this film in time. It came out in 1941. America was not yet involved in World War II. There was a possibility, not a major possibility, that they would not side with the Allies.
Wait a minute, there was a possibility they'd side with Nazi Germany?
There were people
I don't think I've ever heard that.
Well, there were people in America that wanted them to side with Nazi Germany,
sure,
or at least stay out of it, and that is part of the reason why they were not involved yet.
Well, plenty of people in elites across the world were very happy with the idea of the Nazis.
Yeah. Charles Lindbergh certainly wanted them to take the Nazi side, if anything. You turned to me and said, was there really a danger of a fascist takeover of the United States in 1941?
Well, I didn't mean particularly in that year was it happening. But yeah, was there anyone worrying about this other than Frank Capra and Robert Riskin?
Well, throughout the 30s, I think Depression scholarship will mostly agree that whatever possibility there was of that was foreclosed upon by FDR's skillful left-center project.
So really, this is almost like It Could Happen Here science fiction alternate universe movie.
Sure.
That's just, as I say, what if we could start a populist movement and it was hijacked by American fascists.
Yeah. Well, and you know that novel, It Can't Happen Here, is from the late 30s. It was a very popular novel.
Yeah, sure.
Which is about a fascist takeover of the United States. And there was a lot of resentment of FDR, obviously, certainly amongst the business class. And there was always a danger that if certain things went really wrong and the public turned on FDR big time, then yeah, they could possibly bring something like fascism into the US context. They certainly wanted to, but there wasn't enough popular force behind it. So yeah, if you got master emotional manipulator like Frank Capra on board with something that eventuated in the nomination of someone like a Hitler in the United States, it's just a nightmare domino effect kind of thing.
Of course, the Riefenstahl figure in this film is Stanwyck's character.
Yes. She's the protagonist of the film.
And there is evidence that, well, I mean, although a committed member of the Nazi Party who thought that Hitler was the wonderful sort of father figure that would lead Germany into a bright new future, Riefenstahl didn't know that massive amounts of people were going to die as part of this. Like,
well, she should have known.
Be murdered, be put into ovens.
Yeah, she should have known, but whatever.
Systematically, not just as a result of fighting.
Right.
Remembering this from the documentary.
The Wonderful, Horrible Life of Leni Riefenstahl.
Yeah, which I haven't watched for decades, but when she found out at a very particular point what was happening, she was extremely upset. But then at that point, by that time, it's like, what are you gonna do? And I'm not defending Leni Riefenstahl by saying this, I'm just saying that it could make an analog for the Stanwyck character.
But I'm less interested in that, and I'm in general less interested in the overt political statements made in Capra film.
Well, this is a veritable smorgasbord of overt political statements.
Well, it is, but it's also at a much deeper level, a more theoretical level. It's about the postmodern condition. It has things to say about the self in our modern discursive context that goes well beyond, which political party is good. Because none of the political parties are good, obviously. I mean...
Fine, go ahead, go into that, because I'm not getting anywhere with this Jesus Hitler thing. And I don't think they are either.
Look at how incredibly confused and in such an amazing way this movie comes across. The one thing that if you read the name above the title that you can never forget, and I read it when I was a kid. I've said before, Frank Capra was my favorite director when I was a teenager.
What movies?
It's a Wonderful Life, Meet John Doe, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. All the ones I saw I thought were amazing. It happened one night.
Mr. Deeds?
Mr. Deeds I always loved as well, but not quite as much as the others.
That's my bête noire.
So this one, the name of the title, it's an interesting book. It's a terrible book in a lot of ways, and it has nothing to do with reality in most cases. But one thing that I do feel comes across with the force of truth is Capra's struggle to articulate what happened with Meet John Doe. They filmed 5 different endings. They weren't happy with any of them. Basically, Capra said, we wrote a scenario that had no ending to it, could not be ended in any kind of satisfying way.
That's true.
And that is part of why I think it's such an amazing movie, and that's the kind of work of art that I gravitate toward the most. Stories, novels, movies that just fall apart, like Pierre or The Ambiguities.
All right.
So that's what this movie does. It is so laser focused on problems that are, irresolvable, and I love that. Capra didn't love it. He was very upset about this movie. He just couldn't make it into a kind of satisfying entertainment.
Another thing I stumbled across on the internet a few days ago was some kind of conversation with Orson Welles and another filmmaker, I can't remember who, but the topic of discussion was Gary Cooper and how Orson Welles was, in the language of the discussion, queer for him and turned into a girl watching him. And Welles was saying, that's just movie stars and it doesn't matter whether they're great actors or not. But in this movie, Cooper does some great acting.
He sure does.
And it's kind of amazing because a lot of it is silent. There's a lot of things where he's just reacting to people, but then he does get some long speeches and he does a great job with them too.
My estimation for Gary Cooper just grows over the years. I always liked him, but I do think the more I see of him and the more I rewatch his films, the better they get.
Like I said, my problem with Mr. Deeds is not how he performs the character. He performs the character as you would have to. My problem is the character.
Now, this character, think about the postmodern critique here that we're getting. There's some deep identity confusion going on in this film, right? Gary Cooper is a drifter. The only identity he really has is that he likes to throw the baseball and tramp around the United States with the Colonel.
Not just a drifter. He's fallen on hard times. He can't find work not work that he wants to do.
Yeah, but he was always a Bush League pitcher, which means basically you weren't getting paid nearly enough to live on, even during the summer, and then you didn't have any work in the winter. And
then he's just an unemployed guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Like all the other guys lined up in the newspaper office.
But he has no convictions. He doesn't have any kind of political ideology he adheres to until it's written for him.
Now, considering Capra's hostility to state-based solutions for the economic problems he poses, it's interesting that the voice of libertarianism, as well as a sort of homespun, threadbare Thoreauvianism.
Yes, he's definitely a Thoreauvian.
Is Walter Brennan.
Yeah, the Colonel.
Who gets kicked out at a certain point in the movie. He's like, bye-bye, you're gone.
Yeah.
Gary Cooper's sort of regretful, but that aspect of his personality leaves the movie voluntarily. And
amazing thing. And Carney does a great job, I think, of tracing this out. The degeneration in this male visionary figure from Mr. Deeds to Mr. Smith to Meet John Doe. So in Mr. Deeds, you have a character who encounters some difficulties, but emerges 100% triumphant in the end when he finally decides to speak in the courtroom. In Mr. Smith, you have a character who, facing unbelievable odds, at least manages not to get kicked out of the Senate. But does he achieve anything else? No, not really. He certainly doesn't emerge victorious. He makes Claude Rains try to kill himself. But is he going to reform the system? I don't think so. He is at least going to get married to Saunders, which is cool for him, but he is not going to revitalize the American system, even though you kind of feel like it at the end, because this is what Capra always does. He doesn't have to do this. It's an interesting double agenda that he has. He wants to tell the truth about the world as he sees it, which is that you can't fix anything, no matter how hard you want to. But he wants to celebrate the desire to make a difference as an individual and as an artist.
By the way, when I said Walter Brennan was the voice of libertarianism, I of course meant individualism, not starting a business and not having any laws and paying taxes.
But you compared him to Thoreau, and I think that's perfect. Meet John Doe, there is no voice outside of the system in this film, because the voice that Gary Cooper speaks in is written for him by someone inside the system.
Yeah, I was going to say, what is this theme with these men being the puppets? Okay, he evolves into more than a puppet, but Jefferson Smith is the puppet of Jean Arthur.
Okay, no, but there you've got an interesting synergy, because she has the knowledge and the rhetorical skills in some respects, but he has the idealism that activates the whole thing.
But she also has the idealism. She
but it's
needs
dormant.
To meet him. Yeah.
In this one, there's none of that. Barbara Stanwyck is an employee at a third-rate newspaper that gets taken over by a proto-fascist. Nobody knows about this at the time, but they know something's going on. And she's asked to write a bunch, increasingly nationally prominent articles about what may or may not be wrong with the United States in 1940. And they find this guy, they hire Gary Cooper to speak the lines when they get to the point where they need to prove that someone other than an employee of the newspaper is John Doe.
Yes, but he is her invention, but then he comes to believe in what she's doing. And she also comes to believe in what she's doing once her mother gives her the key to making a good speech, a good populist figure, by saying, just use the words of your father. So it's like Stanwyck is being inhabited by the ghost of her father, that she then transfers into Gary Cooper, who then becomes her father. And as in Mr. Deeds and Mr. Smith, this causes a very big problem in the two of them believably coming together sexually. And they don't. Like at the end of Mr. Smith, you've got like a fainting Jimmy Stewart, who presumably is going to wake up and marry Jean Arthur.
Yeah.
But at the end of this movie, they haven't even really had a reconciliation, and he's carrying her possibly dying body.
Yeah.
After she saves him from suicide from the top of the building.
I think the key thing in terms of where it fits into that cycle is that now there's no one. There's no lone person crying out in the wilderness against the state or against the powers that be. There is kind of what it shows you more than anything is just kind of instability within hegemonic system. There are tools within the system as it is to mount some kind of a critique that you can put into the mouth of anyone. And some people may respond to it. But there isn't, even though we get appeals to Jesus in here, we don't get anyone supernaturally thrown into this worldly situation the way Jefferson Smith seems like a kind of messiah figure, and the way, in a different way, Mr. Deeds also feels like that.
Okay, sure.
And that's why this film is so much more interesting when you're thinking about what it has to say about personality formation.
Well, no, I mean, the way in which it's a remake of The Miracle Woman is that they start by playing a hoax, and then they come to embody the ideas behind the hoax.
Yeah.
Basically. And then that abstract figure that doesn't totally correspond to any of them, not to Stanwyck, not to John Willoughby, and not to Stanwyck's father, but this abstract figure is evoked, and that is the person, the symbol that everybody comes to believe in. And the idea is that Christ was one such symbol.
And another thing that Capra's saying, on both a philosophical and a political level, it kind of is anticipating Adornian critiques of the culture industry, right? The film seems to be saying that to do anything effective, you have to use the mechanisms of communication that are available to you, and they're all controlled by capital, and they're going to torpedo your movement and turn it into the exact reverse of whatever you want it to be. There's no film that even comes close to talking about anything like this again, probably until the 80s or 90s. Nothing like this. Can you think of anything that is this insightful about the perils of the attempt to communicate?
Oh, I don't know.
I think it's astounding.
I mean, it's a film of ideas, and it's almost a sort of science fiction film, and in all of those ways, it's not the sort of thing that appeals to me.
Really?
I did find it interesting, for sure. I liked it. Well, I don't even know if I liked it. I admired it. What does all of this have to do with Stanwyck and Capra, though? Now, I have heard I know this is one film that I have read about every now and then, because it's a very famous one, and I have heard it said that of all of their films together, this one seems to register a betrayal on her part, a feeling of being betrayed by her. Well, I mean, obviously the character does betray him very badly, but
But she's the stand-in for Capra. She's the creator. She is the one writing the lines. She is the one establishing the entire persona for Meet John Doe. So I mean, this is the one where he's most fully identified with Barbara Stanwyck as a character.
The two are emotionally separated for the whole last sequence of the film to a degree that doesn't exist in the Jean Arthur films, even though she is also a betrayer. So, I mean, I feel like if you want to read the film autobiographically, I feel like there is some credence in that, but that doesn't get you very far.
Yeah, I don't think... No, I think it's really fascinating that he wanted to bring her back as a character that is 100% his stand-in in the film.
Yeah, but of course, as we've been saying, that's what she started out as.
Yeah, but never this much, because he's not identifying with Gary Cooper's character at all.
You can even see, like I said, you can even see like a faint sketch of this, so to speak, in Ladies of Leisure, in that it is the Gary Cooper character who represents hope that she is trying to capture, and yeah, but he doesn't exist. But he doesn't actually exist. She is trying to create this figure of hope, and he becomes the actor who realizes it.
Yeah, her face lights up as soon as he walks into the room when they're trying to audition tramps to fill this role.
That's because he looks like Gary Cooper.
Yeah.
As everyone makes clear.
But it's much more than that. Her mind is active with the possibilities that he presents. It's not just that she's attracted to him, but he represents a whole constellation of things to her that goes back to her father, obviously.
So yeah, you could say that she is in the artist's role from Ladies of Leisure.
Well, she is.
And he is in the tramp that gets picked up off the street.
Yeah,
role.
he's the model.
Yeah.
In one of these works of art that benefits immensely from its own internal contradictions. It's a fun game to play with yourself. Like, how would you have ended it? I think they probably did pick the best one. It's not a hopeful ending, despite...
Well, as I said, I mean, Stanwyck may even be dead.
Yeah, she might be, but I doubt it. But I don't think that they're going to win. You know, the final line is, the people, try and lick that. And of course, D.B. Norton is going to lick the people. I don't think there's any question about that. James Gleason, his bravado is misplaced at the end of this film.
As everyone says, nothing happens to Mr. Potter at the end of It's a Wonderful Life. It's just George Bailey rediscovers the meaning of his life.
Exactly. That's every Capra movie is like this. There is some kind of triumph that is snatched from the jaws of defeat, but it's not the major battle that is won.
Well, I mean, if you want to talk about it that way, what is the triumph here?
That he doesn't kill himself.
Well, how is that a triumph, though?
Because there are a few people that care about him and they don't want him to die. But that's it. They're not going to restart the John Doe movement and remake America in the image of a Christian utopia.
Then what was the purpose of all of that?
There wasn't any. That's what's so amazing about it. It was never going to work.
I mean, obviously...
And it never will work.
Just as when we were talking about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, although that was several months ago now. When were we even talking about that?
Well, when we saw the Jimmy Stewart retrospective.
Wow, all that time ago? Before COVID?
Yeah, well, we did our special on it in March, I think.
Because I remember referencing Bernie Sanders' political campaign then. And of course, that's where my mind went again, as even trying to find some kind of faint, real-world, recent parallel, which is the idea that it is actually possible, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Jesse Jackson or whatever, it is actually possible to start a utopian populist movement in the United States. That's possible. But every elite would have to be on board with it and not actively working against it in order for it to spread. So when you're talking about the means of communication.
Yeah, but...
I mean, it was a very easy thing to shut down.
Yeah, and it also can't be constructed on the basis that they're trying to do it on in this movie, just on the idea that everyone's just going to be better.
They're all going to, well, no, you're going to love your neighbor and get to know them and take care of them.
No, that's not going to ever work. I hope one day to either see from Earth or from some other vantage point in the cosmos a successful socialist party in North America, but they won't be saying we just have to be nicer to each other. They're going to say we have to change the way our economic system works. That makes sense to me as a populist movement that can get off the ground. But if you're leaving that out, and they are leaving that out, they're talking about dealing with the fallout of economic crisis, but they're talking about it by saying we all just have to aid each other mutually and forget about using the government
Mr.
to
Deeds
help.
is actually more explicit about there needing to be, on some basis, wealth redistribution. Job creation, anyway.
Yeah, helping each other. But again, even in Mr. Deeds, it's just a private... Capra is big in all of his movies on... people with money, people with some way to help others should do it regardless of...
But what is being advocated for here is exactly the basket you'd have to put your eggs in if you're not going to advocate for government or state-based redistribution of wealth.
Yeah, it's
because
hopeless.
The only other possibility is to start a feeling-based movement that spreads through an entire population by appealing to populist instincts in a Hitler-like way, but not the terrible base instincts, but the good, higher, sublimated Christian ones that are just like Dad taking you on his knee.
Yeah.
Speaking of Dad taking you on his knee...
And yes, that's an amazing scene. This is much more awkward than anything David Manners does. Long John Willoughby...
And the looks Stanwyck just keeps giving him through this whole speech.
It's insane.
Who the hell came up with this?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's couched in... This is, well, the early 40s, but it's couched in the language of someone who's read Freud.
Yeah, and the thing is, she's complicit in it because she turned the John Doe character into her father and says she's falling in love with him. And then it's all coming back to her because now John Willoughby thinks he's John Doe, who thinks he's her father. And they're all going to spank her for doing it. And he goes into it at great detail.
The spanking is a symbol.
Sure.
And basically, it's a gangbang by John Doe, her father, and the minister.
Just everybody's getting in on it. Yeah.
It's really disturbing.
Whack her one for me, Pop.
And I kept whacking you and whacking you and whacking you, and he whacked you, then I whacked you.
And it only stops because Beanie walks in and says...
That whacking would have gone on forever.
If you're done whacking her. And then, of course...
But I mean, this is an example of the movie's acknowledgement of the complete sexual impasse presented by this Freudian configuration in all of these movies. Now, and I was thinking about this because of your thesis that Jean Arthur and in this movie Stanwyck are the Capra stand-ins. That means Capra was romantically in love with his father. Either that or something that his father represented, in any case.
It's the family romance.
But yeah, is it the family romance? Is it like Late Spring, but with a boy? Why did Freud never write about that? Or is it that he is trying to put these feelings into a romantic comedy context and it just like breaks it every time, just breaks it?
It just turns it into something else, that's all. To me, Meet John Doe is one of the great films, and it doesn't make it a bad film that it's so fucked up. It just makes it all the more interesting that it's so self-aware of the Freudian underpinnings of its central romance or thwarted romance or attempted romance. Now, I want to think for a minute about the scene where Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck, on the eve of the convention, are talking over how this whole thing happened, how these platitudes that they're throwing out there on the airwaves and in the newspapers have managed to create this effect across the nation. And Cooper starts talking about the hunger that people have for something that they can't name.
Sure.
Again, the transcendental longing. It's back of all of these doomed to fail attempts to speak something that will have lasting value or really communicate what is inside a subject, can never quite get out. Carney goes back to experience all the time as well, Emerson's experience, which is primarily about Emerson's tragic sense of the subject's inability to fully interact with other subjects. In that scene, you're definitely getting at some of that same powerful inarticulateness, the dynamo that is powering most people, or all people, really. He's saying this must be what we're appealing to. We're holding out this possibility, a way we're going to create these clubs wherein people are really going to be able to say the things they want to say to each other, and of course it's not going to work out.
Which I guess are like Boy Scout clubs or whatever that...
The camps, the National Boys Camp. Yeah, except that in that film you don't get nearly the sense of futility that you get in this one. Capra...
By the end you damn well do.
In this movie I think it's just a lot more clear about the fact that there really is no way to meet that need.
I don't know if I agree with that at all. Because, on the contrary, I was feeling skepticism toward the movie's premise that it would be this easy to start a mass movement on this scale.
I don't know about that. It's just a fandom.
Yeah, but no one's ever done it. I know, that's just, that with science fiction films you just have to go with it, but whatever the premise is.
They say that they've spoken to 300,000 people in their barnstorming tour, which is like 1% of the population. So, yes, there are clubs all across the country. It's always kind of just speculative whether that will really translate into votes. And it never gets tested because of the events that happen that torpedo the club. But again, it doesn't have to have real-world translatability. It's something that the film is positing. Everyone in America, everyone in the world is hungering for something like this. Whether they actually join a club or not is kind of immaterial. It is trying to present a forum in which there can be perfect understanding between people, and I think the film is also saying, well, it's holding out that possibility that it's doomed to fail. And we see it in the fact that even the people pushing it don't really even know how to communicate with each other and don't know what they're trying to say, even if they could understand each other.
Where do you see that?
Everywhere. John Doe doesn't even know who he is. He keeps mixing up who he is. When he's talking about the first person, he gets mixed up about whether he's John Doe or whether he's John Willoughby. Anyway, the way the film ends is really fascinating, and we talked about all the different options, but yeah, the great thing is that basically there's no way for Cooper to do anything that's unscripted in that situation. He's either going to play the role as originally scripted and jump off the roof, or he is going to play it the way people now want him to play it, which is just to go away and not cause any more commotion on Christmas Eve. And so, again, there's no way for him to assert any kind of visionary presence in the midst of a kind of fallen world and do something completely unexpected, like propose a national boys camp or expose everyone as doodlers and pixelated and etc. So here he's going to do something that has already been foreordained, no matter what it is. And his choice is really only the same kind of choice that you get at the choose your own adventure book, which is turn to page 22 or turn to page 33, and that's it. And that's a very diminished scope of agency for a Capra protagonist, which again, he's an ersatz protagonist. And here we should get back to Barbara Stanwyck, who is the real protagonist, who has certainly, I think the film makes it clear from the way you're introduced to the characters that it's her story. She is working for this newspaper, gets fired because she is an old-fashioned advice to the lovelorn columnist or something. We don't really know what her column was, but she gets letters and prints them. She doesn't fit in with this new streamlined bulletin, and she conceives this whole scheme to remain culturally relevant and to stay afloat in the torturous economy of the late 1930s, early 1940s, before the war boom takes over. Her struggle, she is obviously the Capra analog. She is the artist trying to say something, trying to earn a living, and trying to feel something about what she's doing.
Two things. First of all, going way back to what you were saying about the ending of the movie, and what is John Doe supposed to do? Because, again, we watched Bitter Tea of General Yen right before seeing this movie, and the continuity between Megan and Gary Cooper in this movie is desire that I guess sometimes manifests in Capra's characters to become Christ figures.
Sure.
And it is ultimately decided that that is not a choice that any individual actual person makes. You can't just decide I am personally going to change the world and do that. That's going to fuck up somehow.
Yeah.
It's going to fuck you up. It's going to fuck other people up, right? So there's that. But the importance is this yearning, this hunger, this desire for the characters to do it however misguided it might be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And Capra wants to honor that while also saying it's not going to work.
And then the other thing is that, of course, this John Doe story, that ultimately meaningful John Doe story that Stanwyck's character Anne wants to cook up in this movie, basically is the George Bailey story. So Capra, this is like a meta story about coming up with the actual story that he does come up with, which also has the Christmas suicide in it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly a relationship between...
a struggling toward, like, first coming up with it as this idea, and this stupid idea, right? This almost Preston Sturges-like hoax, right? And then actually delivering it as the story that he wanted to tell, and frankly as a story that he was always reaching toward telling.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question that It's a Wonderful Life is kind of, like, there's nowhere for him to go after that. He's done exactly what he's always been trying to do.
And in the best way that he could possibly do it.
But along the way, he did a lot of other things that don't really fit in with what It's a Wonderful Life is trying to do. And Meet John Doe is one of the great signposts on that road, because he's bringing in a whole bunch of things that will ultimately be sidelined in It's a Wonderful Life, because we're so intimately in the mind of George Bailey that we can't doubt his solidity as a person. Whereas in this film, everyone is so fractured. I mean, Stanwyck, it's really interesting because as soon as she starts to write and becomes the power behind the figure of John Doe, I mean, she really loses...
But I just find this so interesting. I'm not going to be able to come up with any thesis related to it on this podcast, but this weirdness, can't really think of other analogs for in art, of a male artist creating this female character who creates a male character. Isn't it weird? It's interesting. I don't know what it means. Yeah, we're not going to come up with anything right now, but it's definitely food for further thought. The female character is standing in for him and his mixed up feelings about his father. Or a father, or father figures. So I don't think it's a retrograde idea about women only being able to exercise power through male means. I actually think it's personal, and it's personal to this artist's psychology, and therefore it bears further thought.
Sure.
I don't think it's just a social gesture.
There are numerous women in Capra films who had a father who was a doctor who helped people without taking money. And this is the apotheosis of that, because she takes all of that and turns him into this kind of nationally prominent golem that Gary Cooper plays.
It's like he somehow needs this intermediary of the female character to get at this father character. An intermediary is necessary. You can't just get at it directly or identify with it directly. I don't know.
Sure, it's interesting. You should write an essay on it.
Well, I'd have to know what I think about it first.
All right, I guess that's all we've got this week.
What? You're done? There's no more John Doe talk?
There's endless amounts of John Doe talk possible. Many adventures are possible, but I think probably we've given people more than enough for this week.
The major difference from the Sternberg-Dietrich collaboration is that although she has somewhat different valences in each movie, and a completely different one in The Blue Angel, the Dietrich figure is basically always representing the same thing. And it's just a testament to her wit as an actress and the perfect realization of those films that it remains interesting, even though she's always the same thing. But that's not true of this series of movies.
No, he gets a lot of different types of performances out of Stanwyck. Now, he will use her powerful instrument in some similar ways. Certainly the emotional crisis near the end of the film, he wrote about that in The Name Above the Title. Put Barbara Stanwyck in the last few minutes of your movie and just turn her loose. You could see that he did turn to that gambit several times. Although in most of the early ones, I guess in all of them, she winds up kind of mute by the end, which is interesting.
Sure.
The very, very end. The last scene in...
Well, even in this movie, she's pretty mute at the end.
Okay, I guess that's right. Yeah, so let's go over it. In Ladies of Leisure, she is awakened from her suicide attempt in a hospital bed, and Jerry Strong's telling her it's going to be okay. She doesn't say anything. In Forbidden, she walks off after tearing up the letter on the street, and she doesn't say anything. She's got no one to say anything to anymore. In Miracle Woman, she has joined the Salvation Army.
And she looks very happy, and she's going to marry David Manners, who may or may not recover his sight. I imagine that the ending was put in there because the heroine couldn't marry a blind man? I have no idea.
No, I don't think so. It's just natural that they would be hoping that something might change for him because he wants to regain his sight, but I think it's pretty clear he's not going to.
Anyway, that's the happiest ending.
It's the happiest ending, but again, she doesn't say anything. Hornsby's talking to his boxer. He says she gave up $1 million for that to join the Salvation Army. Bitter Tea of General Yen, we've already discussed. She is sitting next to Walter Connolly. She doesn't say anything as he rhapsodizes about the dead General Yen. And in Meet John Doe, she erupts into a hysterical speech on the top of the building.
She briefly turns into Mr. Smith. She erupts into hysterical speech and then faints.
Yeah, so she is completely unconscious at the end of Meet John Doe. So that's really fascinating. That's where he leaves Barbara Stanwyck every time.
Well, I mean, she's been through big ordeals in each of these movies, and at the ending, the ending is a new beginning, basically, in every case.
In every case, yeah.
A new beginning that's very touch and go.
Forbidden, it's like probably just complete obscurity and death eventually. But the others,
yeah,
yes.
But she got to shoot the hell out of Ralph Bellamy, so that was more satisfying than anything that happens to Irene Dunne in Backstreet.
That's our discussion of the 5 Capra Stanwyck films. I could probably talk about these for several days to come. I'm sure we'll have cause to reflect back upon them at different times in different contexts. And in the meantime, we'll be back with you next week. It's the final entry in our Hollywood Studios Year by Year for 1933. We'll be looking at 2 Universal films by James Whale.
Oh, great.
By Candlelight and Kiss Before the Mirror. So
we don't know anything about these. And James Whale had a long and not very illustrious career at Universal after his more famous movies of the early 30s, and we don't know whether all or any of this is good.
Oh no, I do. His career's going great all the way up till Showboat, and then it goes bad for Universal, it goes bad for James Whale. But now we're still in Whale's salad days.
All
so
right, excellent. That ought to be good.
Let's meet again, same time, for Universal 1933.